Richard Hayes slid the divorce papers across the courtroom table and smiled at his wife of 20 years, like a man tipping a waiter. "Sign fast, Evelyn," he said loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Lauren's got a doctor's appointment. The baby, you understand." His pregnant girlfriend giggled. His mother nodded from the gallery, and Evelyn Carter simply picked up the pen calm as still water, because Richard had no idea that the woman he was discarding held every thread his entire empire hung from. Before we go further, if stories about quiet strength and dignity move you, please subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because this one turns in ways you will not expect. And when you comment, tell me the city where you're watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The family court on Lafayette Street had seen 1,000 marriages end, and the clerks who worked there believed they could predict the ending the moment a couple walked through the doors. They watched the way people held their shoulders. They watched whose hands trembled. And on that gray Tuesday morning, every person in that courtroom had already decided how the story of Richard Hayes and Evelyn Carter would end. They expected Evelyn to break. She was the quiet one. Everybody knew that. For 20 years she had been the woman in the background of Richard's photographs, the woman who smiled softly at galas and never gave interviews, the woman who let her husband do all the talking while she stood a half step behind him. People who didn't know her assumed she was shy. People who did know her assumed she was weak. And Richard, who should have known her better than anyone alive, had spent 2 decades assuming she was nothing at all. So when the divorce was announced, the whispers all pointed the same direction. Poor Evelyn. 20 years thrown away for a woman half her age. She'll fall apart. She'll cry on the courthouse steps. She'll beg him to reconsider. Richard was counting on it. He arrived that morning in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, with Lauren Brooks on his arm like an accessory he'd purchased to announce his own renewal. Lauren was 28, radiant, 6 months pregnant, and utterly convinced she had won something. She wore a cream-colored coat and diamond earrings, and she sat down in the courtroom as though she were attending a premiere. Behind them sat Margaret Hayes, Richard's mother, a woman whose spine had never once bent in 76 years, and whose approval had never once been given freely. Margaret watched the proceedings with the faint, satisfied expression of a woman who had disliked her daughter-in-law from the first handshake and was finally, after 2 decades, getting her way. "You're sure she won't make a scene?" Lauren whispered. Richard laughed under his breath. "Evelyn, she's never made a scene in her life. She'll sign, she'll cry a little in the elevator, and by tonight she'll be someone else's problem." Margaret leaned forward. 20 years and I never once heard that woman raise her voice. I always found it unsettling." "It's not unsettling, Mother. It's manageable." Richard adjusted his cufflink. "The best thing about Evelyn is that she does what she's told." And then the door opened, and Evelyn Carter walked in. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry except her mother's watch. Her hair was pulled back the way she'd worn it since she was 30, and her face held no anger, no tears, no fear. She walked to the table, set down a small leather folder, and greeted her own attorney with a quiet nod. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Diane Foster, leaned toward her. "Are you ready, Evelyn? You know you don't have to accept these terms. We can fight for so much more. The apartments, the accounts, the—" "I don't want any of it," Evelyn said softly. Diane blinked. "Evelyn, he's worth over $1 billion. You're entitled to half of everything accumulated during the marriage. You'd walk away with more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes." Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "Diane, I appreciate everything you've done, but I'm not here to take anything from Richard." A small private smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I'm here to give it back." Diane didn't understand what that meant. Almost nobody in that room would understand it for a long time. But Evelyn understood it perfectly. Across the aisle, Richard was watching her with the smug patience of a man waiting to be proven right. He wanted to see the crack. He wanted the tears. 20 years of a marriage he had come to view as a burden, and this was his moment of release, and he intended to enjoy every second of it. "She looks calm," Lauren murmured, a little unnerved. "Shouldn't she be more upset?" "Give it time," Richard said. "She's holding it together for the audience. She always did care what people thought." The judge entered. Everyone rose. The proceedings began, and they moved with the dull efficiency of a machine designed to end things. The judge reviewed the terms, the attorneys confirmed the agreements, and through all of it, Evelyn sat perfectly still, her expression as smooth and unreadable as a frozen lake. When the judge asked whether she understood that she was waiving any claim to spousal support, Evelyn answered clearly, "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." Richard's lawyer nearly smiled. This was better than he'd hoped. No fight over alimony, no fight over property. She was simply handing it all over. "And you understand," the judge continued, "that you are also declining any division of the business assets accumulated during the marriage." "I do." Diane leaned in one last time, whispering fiercely, "Evelyn, please. At least let me get you the residence. You lived there for 18 years. You designed half of it. You don't have to walk out of here with nothing." Evelyn turned to her, and for a moment something flickered behind her eyes, something Diane would only understand much later. "I'm not walking out with nothing," she said. "I'm walking out with myself. That's the only thing in that marriage that was ever really mine." The papers came across the table. Richard signed first quickly, with a flourish, the way a man signs a receipt for something he no longer wants. He slid the documents toward his wife and sat back, and he could not resist the moment. He leaned toward Lauren and said in that just loud enough voice he used when he wanted to be overheard, "Sign fast, Evelyn. Lauren has an appointment. You know how it is. The baby." Lauren laughed softly. Margaret's mouth curved. And a younger woman, a woman who had been more fragile, might have broken right there, might have thrown the pen, might have wept, might have given Richard exactly the scene he was hungry for. But Evelyn Carter simply picked up the pen. She read every page. She did not rush. She did not skim. She read each clause as carefully as if she were reading a contract for a company she was about to buy, and the longer she took, the more the smug patience drained out of Richard's face. He shifted in his seat. He checked his watch. He glanced at his lawyer, who offered a thin, uncertain smile. "Some of us have places to be, Evelyn," Richard said. She did not look up. "I've spent 20 years reading things carefully, so you didn't have to, Richard. I'm not going to stop now just because you're impatient." It was such a small sentence, almost gentle. But something in the room shifted when she said it, some subtle rearrangement of the air, and for the first time that morning, Richard felt a flicker of something he could not name. She reached the last page, she signed her name, and then she did something the papers themselves had granted her, something Richard had barely noticed in the terms because he considered it beneath his attention. Beside her signature, she checked the small box that read, "Petitioner requests restoration of former name." The clerk read it aloud as procedure required. "The petitioner's name is hereby restored to Evelyn Marie Carter." Carter. Richard heard it, and something cold walked up the back of his neck, though he couldn't have said why. For 20 years, she had been Evelyn Hayes, his wife, his shadow, and now with a single check mark, she had shed his name like a coat she had grown tired of wearing. "Well," Richard said, forcing lightness into his voice, "there it is. Carter again. Back to being your father's daughter." Evelyn looked up at him, then fully for the first time all morning, and she smiled. Not bitterly, not sadly. She smiled the way a person smiles at an old joke that no one else in the room is smart enough to understand yet. "Yes, Richard," she said. "Back to being a Carter." A pause. "You never did learn what that meant." The judge declared the marriage dissolved. The gavel came down. 20 years ended with a wooden knock and a stamp of ink, and Evelyn Carter stood up, gathered her small leather folder, and walked out of that courtroom without looking back. Richard watched her go with a strange, hollow feeling in his chest, the feeling of a man who has won a game only to suspect too late that he was playing the wrong one. He turned to his mother. "That went well?" he said. Margaret's eyes were narrowed at the door Evelyn had just walked through. "Did it?" she said quietly. "She didn't fight for a single dollar, Richard. A woman married to money for 20 years, and she walked away without asking for a penny." Margaret's face was troubled in a way Richard had never seen. Either that woman is the biggest fool in New York, or she doesn't need it. Richard laughed, but the laugh came out thinner than he intended. "Don't be ridiculous, Mother. She doesn't need it. She's got nothing without me. She'll be renting some little apartment by the end of the month, wondering how she'll pay for it." "Perhaps," Margaret said, But she did not look convinced, and Margaret Hayes had built her entire life on a single skill, the ability to sense when the ground beneath her was not as solid as it seemed. She was sensing it now. Outside the courthouse, a small cluster of reporters had gathered. They were not there for a story. Not really. Richard Hayes was a known name in New York real estate, a billionaire whose divorces and deals occasionally made the business pages, and someone at the paper had tipped off that his marriage was ending that morning. The photographers had come hoping for the classic image, the tearful ex-wife, the dabbed eyes, the trembling exit. That was the picture that sold. The fallen woman discarded weeping on the courthouse steps. They had their cameras ready. Instead, they got Evelyn Carter walking down the steps at an unhurried pace, her chin level, her eyes dry, her expression as serene as a woman leaving a pleasant lunch. She did not look for the cameras. She did not perform for them. She simply moved through them as though they weren't there. Mrs. Hayes, how do you feel about the settlement?" She paused at that, turned, and corrected them gently. "It's Ms. Carter now." "Ms. Carter, are you disappointed? Sources say you walked away without any financial settlement. Do you have any comment?" Evelyn considered the question, and then she gave an answer that none of them expected, an answer they would replay in their minds for weeks. "I have everything I came here to get," she said. "Have a good afternoon." And she walked past them toward the curb where a car was waiting for her. Now the reporters had assumed, if they had thought about it at all, that a woman leaving her billionaire husband with no settlement would climb into something modest. A cab, perhaps. A rideshare. A quiet exit for a quiet woman. What they saw instead made every camera in the crowd rise at once. Parked at the curb, gleaming under the flat gray light of the New York morning, was a car that did not belong to this century. Long, low, impossibly elegant, its curves, the kind of curves that were sketched by hand in an era when machines were built to be beautiful. It was painted a deep, luminous emerald green, a green that seemed to glow from somewhere inside the metal, and the moment the photographers saw it, the ones who knew cars began to murmur. It was a 1963 Aston Martin DB5, not a replica, not a restoration off a showroom floor. This was the real thing, one of the rarest and most coveted automobiles ever built, a car worth more than most of the apartments in the buildings Richard developed. A priceless piece of history. A machine so valuable that collectors around the world kept lists of every surviving example and who owned them. And Evelyn Carter walked straight up to it, produced a key from her small leather folder, and unlocked the driver's door. The murmur became a roar of shudders. She slid behind the wheel with the ease of a woman who had driven this car 1,000 times because she had. She adjusted the mirror. She pressed the ignition. And the engine came to life with a sound like a lion clearing its throat, deep and unhurried and utterly certain of itself. Now we have to go back inside the courthouse for a moment, because Richard Hayes was just then coming down the steps with Lauren and his mother, and he was in a fine mood right up until the moment he saw the car. He stopped dead. Lauren nearly walked into him. "Richard, what is it?" Richard did not answer. He was staring at the emerald green Aston Martin idling at the curb and at the woman behind the wheel, and his face had gone a peculiar shade of pale. Because here is what Richard knew, what only Richard and a handful of others knew. He had seen that car before. Years ago, early in their marriage, Evelyn had taken him to a garage in Connecticut, a private garage attached to an old family property, and she had shown him a car under a canvas cover. She had pulled back the cover and revealed the Aston Martin, and she had told him, with a rare softness in her voice, that it had belonged to her grandfather, that it was the most precious thing her family owned, that it had been in the Carter family for 2 generations. And Richard, 29 years old and hungry and impatient, had looked at the car and said, "It's just an old toy, Evelyn. If your family's got money tied up in a car, they should sell it and invest it in something that grows." He had mocked that car for 2 decades. Every time Evelyn mentioned it, every time she drove out to Connecticut to have it maintained, he had rolled his eyes. "Still fussing over that old collector's toy? You know what the maintenance on that thing costs. You could buy a new Mercedes every year for what you spend keeping that antique running." "It's not about the money, Richard," she would say. "Everything's about the money, Evelyn. You just never learned that. And now here she was at the wheel of that same old toy, and Richard was realizing with a slow and sickening clarity that he had never once understood what he was looking at. That's... Lauren was squinting at the car. That's a nice car. Is that hers? It's her grandfather's, Richard said, and his voice had gone strange. Margaret Hayes was watching the car too, and her expression was the expression of a woman doing sudden and unpleasant arithmetic. "Richard," she said slowly, "how much is a car like that worth?" Richard swallowed. "A lot," he said. "Millions, maybe more. There are only a few of them left in the world." "And she's had it this whole time," Margaret said, "sitting in a garage, never sold it, never needed to sell it." Margaret turned to look at her son, and there was something almost frightened in her eyes now. "Richard, a woman who owns a car worth millions and keeps it just because she loves it and never once thought to sell it even when she could have, that is not a poor woman. That has never been a poor woman." "She's not poor," Richard said, and even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. "But she doesn't have money of her own. It all came through." He stopped, because he suddenly could not finish the sentence. For 20 years he had told a story to others and to himself, and the story was that Richard Hayes had built everything with his own two hands. The developments, the investment company, the billion-dollar reputation. His story was the story of a self-made man, and in that story, Evelyn was a pleasant footnote, a supportive wife who had contributed a home and a certain social polish, but nothing that mattered. Nothing structural, nothing essential. But now standing on the courthouse steps watching his ex-wife idle at the wheel of a priceless car, she had owned the entire time he knew her. Richard felt the first hairline crack appear in that story. A tiny crack, almost invisible. But he felt it the way you feel the first cold draft that tells you a window somewhere in the house has come open. Where had the money come from really in those early years, when his first development was failing, when the banks were about to pull his financing, when he was 29 years old and drowning, and one phone call away from bankruptcy? Where had the sudden influx of investment come from? He had always told himself he'd landed those investors through sheer force of will, his pitch, his charm, his vision. But he had never actually met most of those investors. The introductions had come through channels he hadn't questioned. Money had appeared at exactly the right moments, on exactly the right terms from funds whose names he'd barely registered. And Evelyn had always been there quietly in the background, saying nothing, taking no credit, asking for nothing. "Richard," Lauren said, and there was an edge of impatience in her voice now because the cameras were all pointed the wrong way at Evelyn at the car and not at the man she'd chosen. "Richard, can we go my appointment?" But Richard Hayes could not move. The Aston Martin's engine deepened. Evelyn checked her mirror one last time. And for a single instant through the crowd of reporters and the gray morning light, her eyes found Richard's eyes on the courthouse steps. She did not glare at him. She did not smile in triumph. She simply looked at him calmly, the way you look at someone you used to know. And then she looked away, because he was no longer worth the length of her attention. And then the emerald green Aston Martin pulled smoothly away from the curb and glided down Lafayette Street. Unhurried, magnificent, disappearing into the traffic like a green flame swallowed by the city. The reporters lowered their cameras. One of them, a young woman from a business paper, turned to her colleague with a strange expression. "That's not a woman who lost anything," she said quietly. "Did you see her face? That's a woman who just got free of something." And on the steps, Richard Hayes stood frozen, watching the empty space where the car had been, and for the first time in his adult life, for the first time since he'd clawed his way up from nothing, Richard Hayes felt afraid. He did not know why. He could not have explained it if you'd asked him. But somewhere deep in the animal part of his brain, a warning had begun to sound low and insistent, the warning of a man who has just realized he never understood the person he married and who is beginning to suspect that this misunderstanding is going to cost him everything. "Richard," Lauren snapped, "the appointment?" He turned to her slowly, and for a moment he looked at her as though he weren't quite sure who she was. Then he collected himself. "Right," he said. "The appointment. Let's go." But as they walked to his car, Margaret hung back a step. and she said something to her son that she would repeat to him many times in the difficult months to come, a sentence that would echo louder and louder as his world began to shift beneath him. "Richard," Margaret said, "you just watched a woman walk away from $1 billion without so much as a backward glance." She paused. "In my experience, the only people who can afford to walk away from money are the people who never needed it in the first place." Richard didn't answer. He got into his car. He drove Lauren to her appointment. He went to his office, sat behind his enormous desk, looked out over the skyline he had helped to build, and told himself that everything was fine. Everything was not fine. He just didn't know it yet. Let me tell you about the phone call that came 3 days later, because that was the moment the first real crack opened in the foundation of Richard's empire, though he didn't recognize it for what it was. It was a Friday afternoon. Richard was in a meeting with his development team going over the numbers for the Harborview project, the biggest thing his company had ever attempted, a $2 billion mixed-use tower on the west side that was supposed to cement his legacy for the next 50 years. The financing was almost closed. The investors were almost committed. Richard was riding high. And then his assistant knocked on the glass door apologetic and said, "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Gerald Weiss is on the line. He says it's important." Gerald Weiss was one of the lead investors on Harborview. His fund was putting in nearly $400 million. Without Weiss, the whole tower of financing became unstable. Richard smiled at his team. "Take 5, everybody. I'll take this." He picked up the phone, warm and confident. "Gerald, good to hear from you. We're just going over the final numbers now, and I've got to tell you, they look even better than we projected." "Richard." Gerald's voice was careful. Too careful. "I'm going to need to put our commitment on hold." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Richard kept his voice steady. "On hold? Well, that's what do you mean on hold, Gerald? We're 2 weeks from closing. I mean, my partners want to take another look at the deal structure. There are some questions about the risk profile. We're not pulling out. We're just pausing, doing some additional due diligence." "Gerald, we've done 6 months of due diligence. What questions? What's changed?" There was a long pause on the line, and when Gerald spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost apologetic, and it carried an undertone that Richard could not quite decode. "Richard, I've got to be honest with you. Some of the comfort we had on this deal came from relationships, introductions, a sense that certain, let's say, sophisticated parties were watching your back on this, and there's been some talk that maybe those relationships aren't what they used to be." Another pause. "Is everything all right on your end?" "Personally, I mean," Richard's hand tightened on the phone, "my personal life has nothing to do with this deal." "I'm sure that's true," Gerald said in a tone that meant he was not sure at all. "Look, let me talk to my partners. I'll be in touch next week." The line went dead. Richard sat there holding the phone for a long moment, and a cold thread of unease wound its way through his chest. Some of the comfort we had on this deal came from relationships. What relationships? Introductions from whom Richard had always assumed the investors came to him because of his reputation, his track record, his brilliance. He had never stopped to wonder whether someone else had been quietly vouching for him all along. He set the phone down. He told himself Gerald was just being cautious. Deals wobbled all the time. This meant nothing. But over the next 2 weeks it happened again and again. A bank that had verbally committed to the construction loan suddenly wanted additional financial reviews, just being thorough. They said, though, they'd never been this thorough before. A pension fund that had been enthusiastic about the project went quiet and stopped returning calls. And one afternoon, an old business partner named Frank Delgado, a man Richard had worked with for 15 years, took him to lunch and asked him a question that Richard couldn't stop thinking about for days. "Richard," Frank said over his second scotch, "can I ask you something man to man? Are you and Evelyn, is the divorce final?" Richard set down his fork. "It's final. Why does everyone keep asking me about my divorce?" Frank looked uncomfortable. "It's just, you know how it is in this business. People talk, and there's been some talk that maybe you should have handled that situation more carefully." "Handled it more carefully, Frank. She walked away with nothing. I couldn't have gotten a better outcome if I'd written the terms myself." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said slowly, choosing his words with visible care, "Richard, in all the years I've known you, I've never been sure whether you understood what you had in that woman." He swirled his scotch. "There are people in this city, serious people, Money, people who thought very highly of Evelyn Carter, thought highly of her family. And I don't think you ever quite grasped that. When you married Evelyn, you married more than a wife. You married into something. And now—" He spread his hands. "Now you've divorced your way back out of it." Richard laughed, but it was a defensive laugh, a laugh with nothing behind it. "Frank, come on. Evelyn's a lovely woman, but she was a housewife. She organized dinner parties. She didn't have anything to do with my business." Frank looked at him with something that was almost pity. "Is that what you think?" he said quietly. "Richard, my friend, I hope for your sake you're right, but if I were you, I'd start asking myself a very serious question." He leaned in. "For 20 years, who exactly did you think was opening all those doors?" Richard went home that night and could not sleep. He lay awake in the enormous bed in his enormous penthouse, with Lauren breathing softly beside him, and he stared at the ceiling and turned Frank's question over and over in his mind. Who had been opening the doors? He got up in the dark. He went to his study, and for the first time in 20 years he pulled the early records of his company, the records from those desperate first years, the years when he'd gone from a failing developer on the edge of bankruptcy to a rising star with investors lining up. He'd never looked at these records closely. He'd been too busy succeeding to examine how the success had happened. And now in the blue light of his computer screen at 3 o'clock in the morning, Richard Hayes began to trace the money. The first major investment, the one that had saved his first development, the one that had launched everything, had come from an entity called the Meridian Trust. He had never known who was behind Meridian Trust. He'd assumed it was some private investor his broker had found, but now following the thread cross-referencing names, he found a connection he'd never noticed. The Meridian Trust was one of several vehicles managed by a family office, the Carter family office. Richard sat back in his chair, and the cold thread in his chest became a cold river. Evelyn's family, the money that had saved him, the money that had built the foundation of everything he owned. It hadn't come from his charm, or his vision, or his force of will. It had come quietly, invisibly, at exactly the right moment from the family of the woman he had just mocked out of his life on a courthouse floor. He kept digging, and the deeper he dug, the worse it got. Investment after investment, introduction after introduction. Favorable term after favorable term, all of it traced back through layers of trusts and funds and holding companies designed to obscure the source to the same quiet origin. The Carters, Evelyn's people, a family he was beginning to understand that did not appear on the covers of magazines because they had no need to, a family whose money was old and deep and patient, the kind of money that financed the things magazines were printed about. And in the middle of it all, silent, uncredited asking for nothing had been his wife. Richard sat in the dark for a long, long time. He thought about all the times he had lectured Evelyn about money, all the times he had explained the business to her as though she were a child, condescending to her, correcting her, dismissing her occasional quiet suggestions. He remembered a dozen board meetings and dinner conversations where she had gently offered an opinion about a deal, a warning about a risk, a suggestion about strategy, and he had waved her off. What would you know about it, Evelyn? Stick to the dinner parties. He remembered with a fresh and terrible clarity a conversation from 5 years ago. He had wanted to move forward on a development in Miami. Evelyn had said softly over breakfast, "I don't think the numbers work on that one, Richard. The absorption rate assumptions are too aggressive. I'd wait." And he had laughed at her and gone ahead, and the Miami development had lost him $40 million. She had been right. She had been right, and he had never once wondered how a housewife had known enough to warn him, because she wasn't a housewife. She had never been a housewife. She was a Carter. "You never did learn what that meant," she had said to him in the courtroom. And now at 4 a.m, alone in the dark, Richard Hayes was finally beginning to learn. He heard a sound behind him and turned. Lauren stood in the doorway of the study, one hand on her rounded belly, squinting at him in the glow of the screen. "Richard, what are you doing up? It's the middle of the night." Richard looked at her. This beautiful young woman he had chosen, and for a moment he couldn't think of a single thing to say. "Just work," he managed. "Go back to bed." "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lauren said. And Richard almost laughed because in a way he had. He had seen the ghost of his own arrogance, 20 years of it standing in the dark and pointing at everything he'd taken and everything he'd never understood he was taking. "I'm fine," he said. "Go to bed." Lauren studied him for a moment longer, and something flickered across her face, some first small seed of doubt, the beginning of a question she would ask herself many times in the months ahead. What exactly have I signed up for, and does this man protect anyone, or does he only take? But she said nothing. She turned and went back to bed. Richard stayed in the study until the sun came up. Across the city, in a modest apartment overlooking the green expanse of Central Park, Evelyn Carter was already awake. She had always been an early riser. She sat at a small table by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the first light spread across the park, and she was not thinking about Richard at all. She was thinking about the future. On the table in front of her was a notebook, one of dozens she had filled over the years, and in it she was sketching out an idea she had been carrying quietly for a long time, an idea she had never had the freedom to pursue while she was managing the invisible architecture of her husband's success. A foundation, a program, something to help women who had given years of their lives to marriages and families and then found themselves suddenly expected to start over with nothing. Women like everyone assumed she was. Women like she had let them believe she was. Because here is the thing that Richard had never understood. The thing that the reporters on the courthouse steps had not understood, the thing that his mother was only just beginning to sense. Evelyn Carter had not spent 20 years being small. She had spent 20 years choosing to be quiet. There is a difference, and it is the largest difference in the world. She had poured herself into a man she believed in, had lent him her family's faith and her family's fortune, and her own considerable mind, and had asked for nothing in return but his happiness, and perhaps someday his gratitude. She had never gotten the gratitude. She had made her peace with that, but she had gotten something else, something she had not expected. On the day she signed those papers and checked the box to reclaim her name, she had gotten herself back. 20 years of herself returned all at once, like coming up for air after a long time underwater. She took a sip of her coffee. She wrote a few more lines in her notebook. And she was not angry, and she was not vengeful, and she did not lie awake at night the way her ex-husband now would. Because Evelyn Carter had learned somewhere in those 20 quiet years the single most important lesson a person can learn. Her worth had never been tied to Richard's opinion of it. It never would be again. She finished her coffee, closed her notebook, and looked out at the park where the morning joggers were beginning their circuits and the sun was climbing over the trees. Somewhere across the city, a man was staring at a computer screen in the dark, watching the foundation of his empire reveal itself to be built on ground he had never bothered to understand. But that was his morning. This one was hers. And down in the building's private garage, waiting patiently in the dim, was an emerald green Aston Martin DB5, a car her grandfather had bought with the first real money the Carter family ever made, a car that had carried 3 generations of a family, that measured wealth not in what it displayed, but in what it endured. Richard had called it an old collector's toy. He had never once asked what it meant, or where it came from, or why a woman who could have sold it for millions had kept it under a canvas cover for 2 decades instead. He had never asked, because it never occurred to him that the quiet woman beside him might be the most valuable thing he would ever have the chance to know. And now she was gone, driving away down Lafayette Street in a green flame, and the doors that had opened for him were beginning one by one to close. Evelyn stood, gathered her notebook, and got ready to begin the first real day of the rest of her life. She had a future to build, and she did not have time to rebuild the past. The Monday after that sleepless night, Richard Hayes walked into his office at 7 in the morning before anyone else arrived, and he did something he had never done in 20 years of running his company. He locked the door behind him, sat down at his desk, and made a list of every person who had ever brought him an investor. There were 11 names on that list. He stared at it for a long time, and then one by one he began making phone calls, and with each call the cold river in his chest ran a little faster. The first man he called was Daniel Roth, a broker who had connected him with 2 major funds in his early years. Daniel had retired to Arizona, but Richard still had his number. The phone rang 4 times before a raspy voice answered. Daniel, it's Richard Hayes. A pause. Richard, been a long time. What can I do for you? Daniel, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Those funds you brought me back in the day, the Sterling Group and the other one, the Callahan Fund, how did you find them? Who put you onto them? There was a silence on the line that lasted a beat too long, and when Daniel spoke, his voice had gone careful in exactly the way Gerald Weiss's voice had gone careful, and Frank Delgado's and everyone's lately. Richard, Daniel said slowly, why are you asking me this now after all these years? Just answer the question, Daniel, please. Daniel sighed a long, tired sound. You really never knew, did you? He said. It wasn't a question. All this time, 20 years, you never knew. Knew what? Richard's knuckles had gone white around the phone. I didn't find those funds, Richard. They found you. I was just the messenger. Somebody made a few calls, put in a good word, told those people that Richard Hayes was a young man worth backing, and that they'd be looked after if they did. Daniel paused. I always assumed you understood how it worked. A man doesn't go from nearly bankrupt to golden in 18 months on his own, Richard. Somebody was clearing the road in front of you. I just held the door open. Richard's mouth had gone dry. Who? He said. Who made those calls, Daniel? Another pause. And then gently, almost pityingly, Daniel Roth said the thing Richard already knew and could not bear to hear. You married her, Richard, and now you've unmarried her, which, if you ask me, was the single dumbest thing I've ever seen a smart man do. The line went dead. Richard set the phone down with a hand that was not entirely steady. He made the second call, then the third, then the fourth, and each conversation was a variation on the same devastating theme. The doors had not opened for Richard Hayes. They had been opened for him, and the hand on every one of those doors, invisible and patient and utterly silent, had belonged to the woman he had just watched drive away in an emerald green Aston Martin. By noon, Richard had stopped making calls. He sat alone in his locked office, the skyline stretched out beyond his windows, buildings he had put his name on, and for the first time he understood that his name was the only thing about them that had ever really been his. Everything else, the foundation, the financing, the faith of serious people had been Evelyn's gift given quietly, taken greedily, and now with a single stroke of a pen on a courthouse floor withdrawn. He picked up the phone one more time and called his chief financial officer. Bring me everything, Richard said. Every early investment, every fund. I want to know exactly who's been behind this company from the beginning, and I want it by end of day. Richard, that's 20 years of records. That's thousands of... By end of day, Richard said, and hung up. Across town at that same hour, Evelyn Carter was signing a lease. It was a modest apartment by the standards of the woman who had spent 18 years in a penthouse. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with tall windows that looked out over the northern end of Central Park. The rent was a fraction of what Richard spent on his wine each month, and when the leasing agent, a nervous young man who clearly had no idea who she was, apologized that the building didn't have some of the amenities she might be used to, Evelyn smiled and told him it was perfect. It's smaller than I expected you'd want, Miss Carter, the young man said, gathering the paperwork. Most people looking to move after a divorce, they want to, upgrade, make a statement. I've spent 20 years making statements on behalf of someone else, Evelyn said. I find I don't need to make any of my own. She moved in with almost nothing. A few boxes of books. Her notebooks, dozens of them, which she arranged carefully on a shelf in the second bedroom, the room she was already thinking of as her office. Her mother's watch. Some photographs, though notably none of Richard. And she brought one thing that surprised the movers, a single framed photograph of an old man standing beside an emerald green car, a photograph she hung on the wall where she would see it every morning. It was her grandfather, Augustus Carter, the man who had bought the Aston Martin with the first real money the family ever made, back when the Carters were not old money at all, back when they were just a family clawing their way up, the same way Richard had clawed his way up, except that the Carters had never forgotten where they came from, and Richard had spent 20 years pretending he'd never come from anywhere. Evelyn stood in front of that photograph on her first evening in the new apartment, and she spoke to it softly, the way she had since she was a girl. Well, Grandpa, she said, I finally did it. I got out. She was quiet for a moment. "You always said I married too young and gave too much. You were right about the giving. But I don't think I was wrong to try. I just picked the wrong man to try it on." The Carter Financial Group did not appear in the news. That was in fact the entire point of it. For 3 generations, the Carters had operated on a principle that Augustus had drilled into every member of the family from the cradle. Real power is quiet, and the moment your name is in the papers, you've already started to lose it. While other wealthy families built monuments to themselves, splashed their names across buildings and charities and galas, the Carters did the opposite. They financed the buildings other people put their names on. They funded the technology companies that made the founders famous. They backed the infrastructure that a nation ran on the bridges and the power grids and the fiber lines, and they took no credit for any of it, because credit was for people who needed to be seen, and the Carters had never needed to be seen. They needed only to be right. And Evelyn had been raised in that world. She had sat at her grandfather's knee learning to read a balance sheet before she could drive. She had spent her summers in the family office, not because anyone made her, but because she loved it, loved the puzzle of it, the way a single well-placed investment could ripple outward and change the shape of things for decades. By the time she was 22, Augustus Carter had told her privately that of all his grandchildren, she had the best instincts he'd ever seen better than his own. And then she met Richard Hayes. He was 29, brash, hungry, and drowning. His first real estate development was collapsing under him, the banks were circling, and he was one bad week away from losing everything. Evelyn met him at a party she'd attended out of boredom, and she watched this desperate, charismatic young man work the room, and she saw 2 things at once. She saw a man on the edge of failure, and she saw a man with a genuine gift, a real eye for what a neighborhood could become buried under a mountain of arrogance and undercapitalization. She fell in love with the gift. She thought she could manage the arrogance. She was half right. She married him against her family's advice. Augustus, still alive then, had taken her aside and said, "That boy will take everything you offer and never once ask where it came from. Some men are grateful, Evie. That one only knows how to be hungry." But Evelyn had been young and in love and certain she could be the exception, certain that her faith in Richard would be repaid, and so she'd done the thing that would define the next 20 years of her life. She had saved him, quietly. She had gone to her family and made the case for Richard Hayes, and because they trusted her judgment, they had backed him. Not with a loan he'd have to acknowledge, not with a check he could see, but the Carter way invisibly through trusts and funds and introductions that looked like luck. The Meridian Trust that saved his first development, the Sterling Group, the Callahan Fund, every one of them Evelyn's doing arranged so carefully that Richard never suspected, because Evelyn understood something her husband never would. A man like Richard could accept help, but he could never accept knowing he'd been helped. It would have poisoned him. It would have curdled into resentment. So she gave him the help and let him keep the pride, and she asked for nothing, and she told herself that his success was her success, and for a long time she almost believed it. But the years wore on that belief the way water wears on stone. She watched Richard grow more certain of his own genius with every deal she quietly rescued. She watched him lecture her about business at dinner parties, explaining concepts to her that she had understood before he was born. She watched him wave away her warnings, the Miami development that lost $40 million a dozen others he'd never even known she'd flagged. And slowly, the man she'd married, the hungry young man with the real gift, hardened into someone who believed his success was entirely his own, and that his wife was a pleasant decoration. And then came Lauren. Evelyn had known about Lauren for almost a year before Richard told her. She'd known the way she knew everything quietly, thoroughly, without making a scene. And what she felt was not at first betrayal. What she felt was a strange, exhausted relief. Because Lauren was the excuse she'd been waiting for. Lauren was the door out of a marriage that had stopped being a marriage a long time ago and had become instead a job. An unpaid, unacknowledged job, keeping alive an empire whose emperor thought he'd built it himself. So when Richard sat her down and told her with that theatrical solemnity of his that he'd fallen in love with someone else and wanted a divorce, Evelyn had not cried. She had simply nodded and said, "All right, Richard." And Richard, being Richard, had taken her calm as confirmation that she'd never really loved him, never really mattered, that the divorce would be as clean and painless as throwing away an old coat. He had no idea that with those words, he had just signed the end of everything he had. Because here is what Evelyn understood sitting in that new apartment overlooking the park, and what Richard was only now beginning to grasp in his locked office downtown. The support that had held up his empire had never been a gift to Richard. It had been a gift to her marriage. The Carters had backed Richard Hayes because Evelyn had asked them to, because he was family, because supporting family was what the money was for. But the moment Evelyn stopped being Mrs. Hayes and became Ms. Carter again, the reason for that support simply evaporated. No one had to withdraw anything. No one had to plot revenge. The support ended the way a plant dies when you stop watering it naturally, quietly, and completely. And so the doors began to close. The morning after his sleepless list-making, Richard got the call from the bank on the Harborview construction loan. Not a suspension this time, a denial. "I don't understand," Richard said on his feet, now pacing his office. "We had a verbal commitment, 6 months of work. What changed?" The banker on the line, a man named Preston, who had golfed with Richard a dozen times, sounded genuinely uncomfortable. "Richard, the risk committee reviewed the file and they're just not comfortable at the current terms. The project's over-leveraged and frankly, some of the soft commitments we were counting on from the co-investors have gotten softer. When Weiss paused, it spooked people. It started to look shakier than we'd assessed." "It's not shaky. It's the strongest project I've ever built." "I hear you, Richard, but I've got to be honest with you as a friend." Preston lowered his voice. "There's a perception out there right now that you've lost something. I don't know what. But when the perception is that the smart money is stepping back from Richard Hayes, everybody steps back. That's just how it works. Nobody wants to be the last one holding the risk." Richard hung up and stood at his window and looked out at the empty lot on the west side where the Harborview Tower was supposed to rise, the building that was going to be his legacy, and he watched it in his mind begin to disappear. That afternoon, his CFO came into his office carrying a thick binder and wearing an expression Richard didn't like. His name was Marcus. He'd been with Richard for 12 years, and he was not a man who rattled easily. He looked rattled now. "You wanted the early investment records," Marcus said, setting the binder down on Richard's desk. "I traced every fund from the first 10 years. Richard, I've got to tell you, I've never seen anything like this." "Like what?" Marcus opened the binder. "Every major early investment in this company going back to the very beginning routes back through a small number of trusts and family offices. On paper, they look independent. Different names, different managers, different addresses. But when you trace the ownership up through the layers, they all consolidate. They're all controlled ultimately by the same source." Marcus looked up. "The Carter family office. Richard, in your first decade, more than 60% of the capital that built this company came directly or indirectly from your wife's family." The number landed in Richard's chest like a stone dropped into a well. 60%. "And here's the part I really don't understand," Marcus went on, his voice dropping. "It's structured to be invisible. Somebody went to enormous trouble to make sure that anyone looking at these deals, including you, would see nothing but luck and good timing. This isn't sloppy. This is the work of somebody who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted more than anything for the credit to go to you." Marcus paused. Richard, who would do that? Who would build the foundation of a man's entire fortune and then arrange it so he'd never know? And Richard, staring at the binder, hearing the answer echo in his own head, could not say it out loud. Someone who loved him and asked for nothing. He sat down slowly in his chair. "Marcus," he said, "how much of the current business still depends on those relationships?" Marcus hesitated. "Directly, not as much as it used to. You've built plenty on your own since then, but indirectly." He shook his head. "Richard, the reputation that lets you raise money today was built on the track record from those early years, and those early years were built on that capital. If the market decides that the foundation was never really yours, that the emperor's been borrowing his clothes this whole time." Marcus didn't finish. He didn't have to. That was the moment, sitting in his office with the binder open in front of him, that Richard Hayes understood the true scale of what he had done. He had not divorced a housewife. He had divorced the architect of his existence. And worse, far worse, he had done it with contempt, with a joke about a doctor's appointment, with 20 years of condescension that she had absorbed in silence, and that he was only now realizing she had never once needed to tolerate. She could have left him at any point. She could have withdrawn the support and let him collapse the way he was collapsing now. And she never had. For 20 years she had held him up, and he had spent those same 20 years explaining to her how he'd done it all himself. Richard put his head in his hands. Meanwhile, Evelyn had begun to build. She did it the Carter way, quietly, without announcement. She rented a small office space in a building she owned a piece of, though no one at the leasing company knew that. And she hired 3 people, a program director, an administrator, and a young lawyer. And she began to design the thing she had been sketching in her notebooks for years, a foundation. Its mission was simple and specific and drawn directly from the life she had almost lived. It would help women who had given years to marriages and caregiving, and then found themselves through divorce or widowhood or simple abandonment, expected to start over from nothing, without a resume, without savings in their own name, without anyone in the world who saw their worth. Women like everyone had assumed Evelyn was. She called it the Second Light Foundation, and when the young lawyer asked her where the name came from, Evelyn said, "Because everyone talks about second chances, but a second chance still assumes the light was ever really yours to begin with. These women don't need a second chance. They need to discover their own light for the first time, at 40 or 50 or 60. That's not a second chance. That's a second light." The lawyer, a woman named Priya, who was maybe 30 and had never heard anyone talk like this, felt something catch in her throat. "How much are we funding this with, Miss Carter?" she asked. "What's the budget?" Evelyn told her. Priya's pen stopped moving. She looked up. "I'm sorry. That's the annual budget." "That's the first year," Evelyn said. "We'll grow from there." Priya set down her pen very carefully. "Ms. Carter," she said, "forgive me. I did some research before I took this job. Everyone said you were a billionaire's ex-wife who walked away with nothing. That's the whole story everywhere, that you gave it all up." She paused. "But that's not true, is it? You didn't walk away with nothing. You walked away with everything. It was always yours." Evelyn smiled, and it was not a triumphant smile, just a tired and honest one. "The money was always mine, yes," she said. "But that's not the everything I walked away with, Priya. The everything I walked away with was the freedom to finally spend it on something I chose. Do you understand the difference? For 20 years, I had a fortune and no permission to be myself. Now I have both. That's the everything." Word of the foundation began to spread slowly in the way that things spread among people who paid attention. And as it spread, a few sharp observers began to put together a picture that did not match the story the tabloids were telling. Here was Evelyn Carter, supposedly the discarded wife of a billionaire, launching a foundation with a budget that no discarded wife could possibly fund. Here was Evelyn Carter taking meetings with serious people foundation heads and university presidents, and the kind of quiet money that recognized its own. And here on the other side of town was Richard Hayes, whose deals were suddenly wobbling, whose investors were suddenly nervous, whose empire was suddenly inexplicably cracking. It did not take a genius to see the shape of it. And New York is not short of geniuses. The first article appeared in a business paper 3 weeks after the divorce. It was small, buried in the back pages, and it was carefully worded to avoid saying anything the lawyers could object to. But its meaning was unmistakable to anyone who could read between the lines. It noted that Richard Hayes's flagship Harborview project was facing financing difficulties. It noted that several longtime investors had recently stepped back. And then it noted with deceptive innocence that Hayes's recently finalized divorce had returned his ex-wife to her maiden name Carter, and it added a single sentence that landed like a bomb in certain circles. The Carter name, the article observed, was one that sophisticated investors in this city had long associated with quiet, patient, and extraordinarily deep capital. That was all, but it was enough. Richard read the article at his desk, and his hands began to shake. Because the connection was now public. The thing he had spent 3 weeks discovering in the dark alone was now sitting in print for every competitor and every skittish investor and every gleeful rival to read. The question that had haunted him privately, who was really behind Richard Hayes, was now being asked out loud in newsprint by people who had begun to suspect the answer was not Richard Hayes. His phone rang within the hour. It was Gerald Weiss. "Richard," Gerald said, and his voice was not careful anymore. It was cold. "I just read the paper." "Gerald, it's tabloid nonsense. You know how these—" "Is it true?" Gerald cut him off. "The Capitol, in the early years. Was it Carter money? Because I've got my partners in a room right now and they're all asking the same thing, and I need to be able to tell them something." Richard closed his eyes. He could lie. He could deny it. But Gerald was a serious man with serious researchers, and the lie would last a day. And when it collapsed, it would take the last of his credibility with it. "Some of it," Richard said, and the words tasted like ash. "In the early years. Some of it may have come through my wife's family. I didn't know at the time. I only found out recently." There was a silence on the line, and then Gerald Weiss said the sentence that ended Harborview. "You built a $2 billion tower on a foundation you didn't understand, Richard. And now the foundation's gone and you're asking me to put $400 million on top of it." He exhaled. "We're out, all the way out. Don't call me again." The line went dead. Richard sat in his office as the afternoon light slid across the floor, and he felt the empire he thought he'd built settling around him like a house whose main beam has just been pulled out. Not collapsing all at once. Collapsing the way real things collapse slowly, with terrible creaking, one joint failing, and then the next, the weight redistributing onto supports that were never meant to carry it alone. And into this that evening walked Lauren. She came into the penthouse and found him sitting in the dark, no lights on a glass of scotch untouched beside him, and she stopped in the doorway. "Richard, why are you sitting in the dark again?" "Bad day," he said. Lauren set down her bag. She was 7 months along now, and tired, and she had begun over these last few weeks to notice things about Richard that she had not let herself notice while he was still married to someone else. The way he spoke about people once they stopped being useful to him. The way his warmth switched on and off like a light. The way he talked about Evelyn, this woman he'd been married to for 20 years, with a dismissiveness that had at first flattered Lauren and had lately begun to frighten her because she had started to wonder whether that was simply how Richard talked about anyone he was finished with. "Richard," she said, sitting down carefully across from him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is the business in trouble?" Richard looked at her, and for a moment, a real moment, he considered telling her the truth. That the foundation was gone, that the doors were closing, that he had discovered too late that everything he had was built on the quiet faith of a woman he'd thrown away with a joke. But the habit of a lifetime was too strong, and instead he did what Richard Hayes always did. "The business is fine," he said. "There's just some noise right now. It'll pass." Lauren studied him, and what she saw in his face was not confidence. It was the careful, practiced calm of a man who was lying, and who was very good at it, and who was probably lying to her the same easy way he'd once lied to his wife. And a cold thought entered Lauren's mind, for the first time, a thought she would not be able to get rid of. If it all falls apart, will he protect me and the baby, or will he do to me exactly what he did to her? Will I be the next person he explains away? "Richard," she said slowly, "the woman you were married to, Evelyn, when things got hard in 20 years, did she ever leave? Did she ever stop supporting you?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Why are you asking me about Evelyn?" "Because I'm about to have your child," Lauren said, "and I'm starting to realize I don't actually know what kind of man you are when things go wrong. So I want to know. Your wife of 20 years. When it got hard. Did she stay?" And Richard, who could not lie to himself in that moment, even though he was still lying to everyone else, said quietly, "She always stayed. She never once left. Not until I made her." Lauren sat back. She put a hand on her belly, and she said nothing, but something had shifted in her, some first crack in the fantasy she'd been living in, and she was beginning to understand that she had left the shore for a man who was right now watching his own ship go down, and that when the water came, Richard Hayes would save Richard Hayes, and only Richard Hayes. The next morning, Richard did something he had sworn to himself he would never do. He got in his car and he drove uptown, and he parked outside the building where Evelyn now lived, the modest building overlooking the park, and he sat there for almost an hour trying to work up the nerve to go inside. He didn't have a plan. He barely had a reason he could name. Part of him wanted to beg her to help him. Part of him wanted to accuse her of orchestrating his downfall. Part of him, the smallest and most honest part, simply wanted to understand how he had lived beside this woman for 20 years and never once seen who she really was. And as he sat there, the door of the building opened and Evelyn came out. She was not dressed like a woman in crisis. She was not dressed like a woman in triumph either. She was simply dressed comfortably, purposefully, a leather bag over her shoulder, and she was talking to a younger woman beside her, Priya gesturing about something, and she was laughing. Richard watched his ex-wife laugh easily and freely in a way he suddenly could not remember ever seeing during their marriage, and something twisted in his chest. She looked lighter. She looked, he realized, happy. He watched the two women walk to the curb, and then the emerald green Aston Martin came around from the building's garage driven by an attendant, and Evelyn thanked him and slid behind the wheel, and Priya got in beside her, and the car pulled smoothly into traffic and was gone. Richard sat in his car outside her building for a long time after she'd left. He never went in. He couldn't. What would he even have said? Help me. She owed him nothing. Take me back. He'd traded her for a woman half her age and made a joke of it in a courtroom. I'm sorry. The word was too small for the size of what he'd done, and he knew sitting there that some apologies arrived too late to be anything but an insult. So he drove back downtown to his office, to his crumbling empire, and he did the only thing he still knew how to do. He tried to save himself. He called an emergency meeting of his board of directors for the following week. He would need their support to restructure Harborview to find new financing to steady the ship. He was still Richard Hayes. He still had a track record, a reputation, a name on a dozen towers. The foundation might have been Evelyn's, but the last decade of growth had been real, had been his, and he told himself that a real man could rebuild on that. What he did not yet know, what he would discover in that board meeting, was that his own directors had been having quiet conversations of their own. That several of them, the independent ones, the ones who'd sat through years of Richard, overriding every voice of caution in the room, had begun to compare notes, and that more than one of them had come to the same private, uncomfortable conclusion. For years there had been a voice of caution in that company that Richard had always ignored, and the deals where he'd ignored it had always been the deals that went wrong. And it was only now, in hindsight, that a few of them were beginning to realize whose voice it had been. Not a board member's, not an executive's. A voice that had reached Richard through his wife in the quiet suggestions he'd waved away at breakfast, the warnings he'd laughed off the notebooks full of analysis he'd never bothered to read. They had lost that voice the day Evelyn Carter drove away from the courthouse, and they were beginning to understand one by one that when Richard Hayes lost his wife, the company had lost the only person who'd ever reliably kept him from destroying it. The board meeting was set for Thursday. Richard prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, with confidence, with charm, with the certainty that he could talk his way through anything. He had done it 100 times. He would stand up in that room, lay out a plan, and rally his directors behind him, because that was what leaders did, and Richard Hayes was a leader. He walked into that boardroom on Thursday morning fully expecting to walk out with his empire intact. He had no idea that the people waiting for him around that table had spent the week discovering exactly how much of that empire had never belonged to him at all, and that the quiet woman he'd mocked out of his life had, without lifting a single finger to harm him, without making a single phone call against him, simply by leaving set in motion the unraveling of everything Richard Hayes had ever believed about himself. The doors of the boardroom closed behind him, and Richard Hayes, for the second time in a month, found himself standing in a room full of people who knew something about his life that he was only just beginning to understand. The moment Richard sat down at the head of that long table, he knew something was wrong. He had chaired hundreds of meetings in that room, and he had always been able to read it in the first 3 seconds, the temperature, the deference, the way people's eyes went to him, waiting to be led. But this morning the eyes did not come to him. They went to their notepads. They went to the windows. They went to each other in quick glances that carried meaning Richard couldn't decode, and the silence in the room was not the silence of people waiting to follow. It was the silence of people who had already decided something before he walked in. "Good morning, everyone," Richard said, forcing warmth into his voice. "I know the last few weeks have been noisy. Let's clear the air and get to work. I've got a plan for Harborview, and I think once you hear it, you'll agree we're in a stronger position than the headlines suggest." He waited for the nods. They didn't come. At the far end of the table sat Howard Klein, the longest-serving independent director, a man in his late 60s who had been on Richard's board for 15 years and had in all that time rarely said much. Howard was old money, quiet money, the kind of man who watched more than he spoke, and Richard had always regarded him as harmless a decoration, a name that looked good on the letterhead. Howard cleared his throat now, and something in the sound made the whole room go still. "Richard," Howard said, "before you present your plan, I think several of us have some questions, and I think it would be better if we asked them before you got too far in." Richard's smile stayed fixed. "Of course, Howard. Ask anything." Howard opened a folder in front of him. "Last week, a few of us started comparing notes about the company, about its history, and I have to say, Richard, some of what we found has been difficult to reconcile with the picture you've painted for us over the years." He looked up. "Are you familiar with the Meridian Trust?" The room seemed to contract. "I'm familiar with the name," Richard said carefully. "The Meridian Trust provided the capital that saved your first development, the one that launched this entire company. Without it, there is no Richard Hayes. Would you agree with that?" "That was 30 years ago, Howard. I don't see the relevance." "The relevance," Howard said, "is that until last week, not a single person on this board, including you, apparently knew that the Meridian Trust was controlled by the Carter family office, your wife's family." He let that sit for a moment. "We built our confidence in this company and in you on a story. The story of a self-made man with impeccable instincts. And we've just discovered that the foundation of that story was quietly financed by a family you've now divorced yourself out of a relationship with. So my question, Richard, and I think it's a fair one, is this. How much of what we thought was your judgment was actually theirs?" Richard felt the blood rise in his face. "That's insulting, Howard. I built this company. Yes, there was early capital. Every company has early capital. But the decisions, the vision, the execution, that was me. That has always been me." And here is where the meeting turned, because a woman halfway down the table, a director named Susan Farrow, who had joined the board 6 years earlier, set down her pen and spoke, and what she said changed the direction of everything. "Richard," Susan said quietly, "can I ask you about the Cranford deal?" Richard blinked. "The Cranford deal? That was 4 years ago. We passed on it." "We passed on it," Susan agreed. "Do you remember why?" "Because the numbers didn't work. The market was overheated. It would have been a disaster." "And do you remember who told you the numbers didn't work?" Richard opened his mouth and then he stopped because he did not remember. He remembered making the decision. He remembered being right. The developer who'd bought Cranford instead of him had lost a fortune when the market turned exactly as predicted, and Richard had told that story at a dozen dinners as proof of his own foresight. But now, with Susan looking at him, he found that he could not actually remember the source of the insight. He'd absorbed it so completely into his own sense of himself that he'd forgotten it had ever come from anywhere. "I made that call," Richard said. "I don't recall consulting anyone." Susan nodded slowly as though he'd confirmed something. "I'm going to tell you something, Richard, and I want you to hear it because I've wanted to say it for a long time." She folded her hands. 4 years ago at the dinner where you first mentioned Cranford, I was seated next to your wife, and Evelyn told me very quietly that she'd looked at the Cranford numbers, that the absorption assumptions were fantasy, and that she'd told you to pass. She said it like it was nothing, like she was mentioning the weather. And 2 weeks later you passed on Cranford and took full credit for the wisdom of it. Susan's voice was steady, but there was an edge underneath it. I said nothing at the time because it wasn't my place. But I started paying attention after that. And Richard, over the last 6 years, every single major disaster this company avoided, and every single one it walked into followed the same pattern. When you listened to that woman, we won. When you didn't, we lost. And you never once knew you were doing it. The room had gone completely silent. Richard stared at her. "You're saying my wife ran this company?" "No," Susan said. "I'm saying your wife saved this company over and over from the one person who could destroy it, which was you. And she did it so quietly and let you take so much of the credit that you managed to convince yourself she wasn't even in the room." Susan paused. "And now she's not in the room. And here we are." Something broke loose in Richard, then some cord of pride that had been holding for weeks, and he stood up. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "I have run this company for 30 years. I have made thousands of decisions, and you're telling me that every good one was secretly my wife's and every bad one was mine. Do you hear how that sounds? I am the reason this company exists, not Evelyn, not her family, me." And Howard Klein, still seated, still calm, delivered the sentence that ended it. "Richard," he said gently, "if you were the reason this company existed, then it wouldn't be falling apart the very month your wife walked out of it." Richard sat back down. He had no answer. There was no answer, because the truth of it was undeniable, now laid out in front of everyone. The month Evelyn Carter left, the doors had closed. The investors had fled. The financing had collapsed. Not because she'd lifted a finger against him. She hadn't made a single call. She hadn't leaked a single document. She had simply stopped being the reason the Carter money and the Carter faith flowed toward Richard Hayes, and without that quiet current beneath him, everyone in the market had felt the water go still and had begun one by one to swim away. The board did not remove Richard that day. It was not that kind of company, and he was not that easy to remove. But they did something almost worse. They stripped him of his unilateral authority over new financing. They installed an independent review committee chaired by Howard that would have to approve every major decision going forward. They took, in other words, the very thing Evelyn had spent 20 years protecting him from, his own unchecked judgment, and they took it away from him publicly in front of the people whose respect he had lived for. Richard walked out of that boardroom a diminished man, and he knew it. And worse, everyone knew it. That night, he did not go home. He went to a bar he'd never been to in a part of the city where no one would recognize him, and he sat alone and drank, and he thought about Evelyn. Not with love. He was not capable yet of anything so clean as love. He thought about her the way a man thinks about a debt he can never repay, with resentment and shame and a grief he couldn't name. He thought about every warning he'd waved away, every notebook he'd never read, every time she'd said softly over breakfast, "I don't think that one works, Richard," and he'd laughed and done it anyway, and lost the money and never once connected the loss to the warning. She had been trying to save him for 20 years, and he had spent 20 years experiencing her attempts to save him as nagging. At the same hour across the city, Evelyn was hosting the first small gathering of the Second Light Foundation. It was not a gala. It was a dozen women in a rented room, women the foundation had begun to help, women in their 40s and 50s and 60s who had given decades to families and then found themselves adrift. Evelyn had not planned to speak, but at the end, one of the women, a woman named Carol, who was 58 and had spent 30 years raising 4 children while her husband built a business he'd left her out of when he left her for someone else, stood up and asked Evelyn a question. "Ms. Carter," Carol said, her voice shaking a little, "how did you do it? How did you walk away from a marriage like that and not fall apart?" "Because I fall apart every single day. I gave that man everything and he threw me away like I was nothing. And some mornings, I can't even get out of bed. So how did you do it?" The room went quiet, and Evelyn, who did not usually talk about herself, set down her coffee and answered honestly. "I fell apart too, Carol," she said. "Everybody thinks I didn't because they saw me walk out of that courthouse without crying. But the not crying wasn't strength. Not at first. It was just that I'd cried all my tears years before, quietly alone in a marriage where nobody noticed. By the time the divorce came, there was nothing left to cry about. I'd already grieved the marriage while I was still inside it." She paused. "But here's the thing I want you to understand. The reason I didn't fall apart permanently isn't that I was strong. It's that I finally understood something. For 20 years, I let a man decide what I was worth. And the day I stopped letting him decide, I discovered the number he'd assigned me had never been real. It was never mine. It was just his opinion, and his opinion was wrong, and I was under no obligation to keep believing it. She looked around the room. Every one of you is walking around with a number some man assigned you, and I'm here to tell you it's wrong. Every single one of them got the number wrong. Your job now isn't to earn a better number from someone else. It's to stop letting anyone assign you a number at all. Carol was crying. Half the room was crying. And Evelyn, who had walked out of a billion-dollar marriage dry-eyed, felt her own throat tighten because this, she understood, was the thing she had been building toward her whole life, and she had needed 20 years of silence to be able to say it. That night, a young woman who volunteered at the foundation, moved by what she'd heard, wrote down the thing Evelyn had said and posted it online without permission, without fanfare. Every single one of them got the number wrong, and your job now isn't to earn a better number. It's to stop letting anyone assign you one at all. By morning, it had been shared 40,000 times. By the end of the week, it was over 1 million. Evelyn had not sought this. She had in fact been avoiding attention her entire life, the good Carter that she was. But something about that sentence and the woman behind it caught fire in a way that nothing about Richard's slow-motion collapse ever had. Because people were tired of billionaires. They were tired of empires. And here suddenly was a different kind of story, a woman who'd had every reason to be bitter and had chosen instead to build something, a woman who'd walked away from a fortune. Not because she was noble, but because she'd finally understood the fortune had never been the point. The journalists came, of course. They always do. They called the foundation. They called Evelyn's lawyer. They wanted the story. And the story they wanted was the obvious one. The revenge story, the scorned wife triumph story, the tale of how Evelyn Carter had brought down her arrogant husband and was now dancing on the ruins. And Evelyn refused every single one of them. "I don't understand," Priya said after Evelyn declined the 4th major interview request in a week. "This is the biggest platform you could imagine. You could tell your whole story. You could tell the world what he did, how much of it was really you, all of it. People would eat it up. Why won't you take it?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Because the moment I tell that story," she said, "it becomes a story about Richard. And I have spent 20 years living inside a story about Richard. I'm not going back in, not even to burn it down." She shook her head. "The foundation isn't about him. Those women in that room aren't about him. If I go on television and talk about my marriage, then everything I build gets stained with his name, and I refuse. He got 20 years of my life, Priya. He doesn't get this too." But one reporter, a woman named Diane Chen from a serious paper, was persistent in a different way. She didn't want the revenge story. She'd covered the Hayes divorce, and she'd been the one on the courthouse steps who'd turned to her colleague and said, "That's not a woman who lost anything." And she called Evelyn's office and left a message that was different from all the others. "Tell Ms. Carter," she said, "that I'm not interested in her ex-husband. I'm interested in what she's building, and I'll write the story with or without her, but I'd rather write the true one." She left her number. Evelyn called her back. They met at a quiet restaurant, and Diane, to her credit, kept her word. She did not ask about Richard. She asked about the foundation, about the women, about Second Light, about the philosophy behind it. And near the end, she asked one question that touched the edge of the thing everyone wanted to know. "Ms. Carter," Diane said, "I have to ask you one question about your former marriage and then I'll leave it alone. There's a lot of speculation right now that your ex-husband's business troubles are connected to your divorce, that you were more involved in his success than anyone realized. I'm not asking you to confirm the details. I'm asking you something simpler. Do you want revenge? Because a lot of people, if they were in your position, would." And Evelyn gave the answer that would become the second thing she said to go around the world. "I'm building a future," she said. "I don't have time to rebuild the past." Diane wrote it down. And when her article appeared, it was not the revenge story. It was a portrait of a woman who had spent her life in the shadows and had finally stepped into the light on her own terms, a woman who had every weapon at her disposal and had chosen to pick up none of them. The article mentioned Richard only once in a single line near the end. Asked whether she wished her former husband ill, Ms. Carter declined to discuss him at all, saying only that she was building a future and had no time to rebuild the past. That line did what 1,000 attacks could never have done. It made Evelyn Carter beloved, and it made Richard Hayes, by contrast, look small. Not because she'd attacked him, because she'd refused to. Her silence about him was more damning than any accusation could have been, because it told the world that Richard Hayes was not even worth her breath. Richard read the article, and it was the silence that destroyed him. He could have fought an accusation. He could have countered a smear. But how do you fight a woman who won't even say your name? How do you defend yourself against being deemed irrelevant? And Lauren read it too. She read it sitting in the penthouse, 8 months pregnant now, and something about that single line, "I'm building a future I don't have time to rebuild," the past went into her like a splinter and would not come out. Because Lauren was beginning to understand in the deepest and most frightening way that she had chosen the past. She had chosen the man who was falling apart, the man whose whole story was about what he'd been, while the woman he'd discarded was busy becoming what she would be. She had thought she was choosing the winner. She was beginning to suspect she'd chosen the wreck. That night she confronted Richard. "I read the article about Evelyn," she said. Richard, who was pouring himself a drink, didn't turn around. "Don't believe everything you read." "Is it true, Richard? That she was behind your success? That the business is falling apart because she left?" Richard set the bottle down hard. "The business is not falling apart." "Howard Klein called the house yesterday," Lauren said. "I answered. He didn't know it was me. He was looking for you, and when I said you weren't in, he said, and I quote, 'Tell him the committee needs the revised numbers before we can approve anything, and if he pushes back again, we'll have to consider next steps.'" "What are next steps, Richard? What committee? What are they going to do to you?" Richard turned around slowly, and for a moment Lauren saw the man underneath. The confidence saw the fear he'd been hiding, and it frightened her more than the confidence ever had. "The board is restructuring some oversight," Richard said. "It's temporary, it's political, it's nothing." "It doesn't sound like nothing." Lauren put a hand on her belly. "Richard, I need to know what I'm walking into. I'm about to have your child. If everything falls apart, what happens to us? What happens to me?" And here was the moment that decided everything for Lauren, though Richard never understood that it was a moment at all. Because what he said without thinking, revealing himself completely, was, "Nothing's going to happen to me. I'll be fine. I always land on my feet." To me, I'll be fine. Not to us. Not we'll be fine. Just Richard always. Richard landing on his own feet alone. Lauren heard it. She heard exactly what it meant. She heard the same thing Evelyn had heard for 20 years, the sound of a man who at the moment of crisis thought only of himself, who saw the people around him not as people he was responsible for, but as passengers he would jettison the second the ship needed to be lighter. She didn't say anything that night, but she started quietly to make arrangements. She called a lawyer of her own. She began to think for the first time about what she would need if she had to protect herself and her child alone. And she thought about Evelyn Carter, the woman she'd helped to displace the woman she'd once regarded with the casual contempt of the young and the chosen, and she felt for the first time something that was almost like awe. Because Evelyn had seen all of this. Evelyn had known exactly who Richard was. And Evelyn had gotten out cleanly with her dignity and her fortune and her future intact, while Lauren had run toward him with her arms open. Meanwhile, Richard's world kept contracting. Harborview died officially 3 weeks after the board meeting. The land was sold at a loss to a competitor, and the competitor, twisting the knife, put out a press release announcing that they had acquired the site after the previous developer was unable to secure financing. Richard's name wasn't in the release, but it didn't have to be. Everyone knew. The great Richard Hayes, unable to secure financing. The self-made billionaire, revealed to have been made by someone else. The story wrote itself, and it wrote itself cruelly, and there was nothing Richard could do to stop it. He fired people. That was the thing Richard did when he was afraid he made other people pay. He laid off 1/3 of his development team. Good people, loyal people. People who had nothing to do with the collapse, and he did it coldly in a single afternoon because cutting costs made him feel like he was doing something. Marcus, his CFO of 12 years, came into his office after the layoffs and stood in front of his desk and said, Richard, some of those people gave you a decade. You could have handled it better. You could have at least talked to them yourself instead of having HR do it. This is business, Marcus. It's not personal. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. You know what I've realized about you, Richard, he said quietly. It's never personal for you. That's the whole problem. In 12 years, I've watched you treat everyone around you like they're temporary, like they're useful until they're not. And I used to think that was just how successful men were. He paused. But then I watched how your wife's people are talking about her out there, the women at that foundation. They'd walk through fire for her. And I realized the difference between you and Evelyn Carter isn't money or family or luck. It's that she made people feel like they mattered and you made people feel like they were disposable. And it turns out in the end, the people who feel like they matter, they stay. And the people who feel disposable the second you need them, they're already gone. Marcus set his badge on Richard's desk. I'm one of them. I'm resigning. I've got another offer, and I took it. I just wanted to tell you why to your face since you never gave anyone else that courtesy. He walked out, and Richard sat alone in his office watching his 12-year CFO leave, and he understood that Marcus was right, and that the understanding had come as all his understandings now came far too late to matter. The empire was cracking, not from any single blow, from 1,000 small failures of a foundation that had never really been his revealed all at once by the departure of the one person who'd been holding it together. And the cruelest part, the part that kept Richard awake at night, was that Evelyn wasn't even trying. She wasn't fighting him. She'd forgotten him. She was out there building something new, something people loved, while he sat in the ruins of something old watching it come down, and she wasn't even watching him fall. That was the thing he couldn't bear. Not that she'd beaten him, that she'd moved on so completely she didn't even notice she'd won. One evening near the end of that terrible month, Richard was working late alone in his emptying office when he found them. He'd been going through storage looking for old files trying to reconstruct the early history of the company for the review committee, and in a box, he'd never opened a box that had followed him through 3 office moves, he found a stack of notebooks. Dozens of them. Bound in leather, worn at the edges, filled with handwriting, he recognized instantly because he'd seen it on 20 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter. Evelyn's handwriting. He sat down on the floor of the storage room and he opened the first one and he began to read. And what he found inside those notebooks was the true history of his company told in the hand of the woman he'd thrown away. Market analyses more sophisticated than anything his paid analysts had ever produced. Risk assessments for every major deal dated detailed, devastatingly accurate. Warnings about the projects that had failed, written months before they failed. Recommendations he'd ignored. Strategies he'd never seen. And woven through all of it in the margins, in the quiet asides, something that broke him more completely than any financial loss ever could. Notes to herself, little private thoughts. He won't listen on the Miami numbers, but I'll keep the analysis in case he changes his mind. Richard's under so much pressure this quarter, I'll route the Sterling introduction through Daniel, so it feels like luck he does better when he thinks it's his own doing. Told R to pass on Cranford. He'll take the credit. That's fine. As long as we're safe. That's fine, as long as we're safe. She'd written we. For 20 years, while he'd thought of himself as a solitary genius, she'd thought of them as we. She'd protected him, managed him, shielded his pride, arranged his luck, and asked for nothing, not even to be known. And she'd written it all down in these notebooks that she'd left behind when she left, because she didn't need them anymore, because they were never about credit. They were only ever about keeping him safe. Richard sat on the floor of that storage room, a 52-year-old man surrounded by the notebooks of a woman who had loved him more competently and more completely than he had ever understood. And for the first time since the day he'd made a joke about her, in a courtroom, Richard Hayes began to cry. Not for the money, not for the empire. For the 20 years he'd spent beside the best thing that ever happened to him, calling it an old collector's toy, and never once bothering to lift the cover and see what was underneath. Richard stayed on that storage room floor until nearly midnight reading, and by the time he closed the last notebook, he was a different man than the one who had opened the first. Not a better man, not yet, but a man who had finally run out of the one thing that had sustained him his entire life, the story that he had done it all himself. That story was gone now. He had read its refutation in his ex-wife's own handwriting page after page, and there was no putting it back together. He took the notebooks home. He didn't know why. Maybe he thought he could learn something from them, some strategy that would save him. Maybe he just couldn't stand to leave them in a box again the way he'd left the woman who wrote them. He stacked them on the desk in his study, and over the following weeks, as his world continued to come apart, he read them the way a drowning man reads the instructions on a life raft he threw overboard years ago. And what he learned reading them was not just strategy, it was character. Because the notebooks did not only contain analysis, they contained a portrait of a marriage told from the side he'd never seen. He found an entry from the year their attempts to have a child had failed for the third time, an entry he was never meant to read. R doesn't know how to grieve, so he works instead. I'll let him. Someone has to hold the sad part, and it may as well be me. He read it and remembered that year, remembered throwing himself into a development, remembered thinking Evelyn had handled the disappointment so well, so quietly, and understood now that she hadn't handled it well at all. She'd handled it alone. He'd left her to carry the grief for both of them, and he'd mistaken her carrying it for her not feeling it. He found an entry from an anniversary he'd forgotten, one of many he'd forgotten. 15 years today. R didn't remember. That's all right. I stopped expecting him to remember things that don't have a return on investment. I remember for both of us. That's my job now. That's my job now. She had turned their marriage into a job silently years ago because he had given her no other way to survive inside it. And she had done the job flawlessly, thanklessly, until the day he handed her the exit, and she took it dry-eyed because there had been nothing left in her to cry with. Richard read these things and did not sleep. While he was falling apart in the dark, Evelyn was rising in the light, and the contrast between them had become by that point the talk of the entire city. The Second Light Foundation had grown from a dozen women in a rented room into something that surprised even Evelyn. The line that had gone around the world, the one about the number no one had the right to assign you, had brought donations, volunteers, partnerships. Universities called wanting to build programs around the foundation's model. Other wealthy women who had their own quiet fortunes and their own quiet grievances began to reach out, wanting to join, wanting to give. Evelyn found herself almost against her will at the center of a movement. But she ran it the Carter way, quietly, effectively, without ever once making it about herself. She hired the women, the foundation helped when they were ready, turning recipients into staff, turning the helped into the helpers. She built training programs and legal clinics and a scholarship fund for women returning to school in their 40s and 50s and 60s. And she mentored personally dozens of young entrepreneurs women, starting businesses late, women the rest of the world had written off, and she gave them the one thing she'd had to learn to give herself. She gave them the belief that their worth was real and did not require anyone's permission. Carol, the woman who had wept at that first gathering, the one who'd asked how Evelyn had walked away without falling apart, became the foundation's first program director. A year earlier, she'd been unable to get out of bed. Now she ran a department. And when a reporter asked her once what had changed, Carol said, "Evelyn Carter looked at me and saw someone worth investing in. And once somebody serious invests in you, you can't quite go back to believing you're worthless. It ruins it, in the best way." Evelyn heard about that quote and laughed and said it was the finest thing anyone had ever said about her. Meanwhile, the notebooks had done something to Richard that even the collapse of his empire had not. They had made him want to see her, not to beg. He knew by then that begging was beneath both of them, and that anything he asked her for would be an insult. But he wanted with a desperation he couldn't fully explain to say one true thing to her before the end. To say out loud at least once, "I saw it. I finally saw what you did. I'm sorry it took me 20 years and losing everything." He got his chance, though, not the way he'd imagined. It happened at a charity function, one of the large ones that the city's wealthy attended as a matter of course. Richard almost didn't go. His star had fallen so far that he no longer relished being seen. But his lawyer told him he needed to be visible, needed to show the market he wasn't finished. And so Richard put on a suit that no longer fit the man inside it and went. And Evelyn was there. He saw her across the room, and the sight of her stopped him cold, because she was not the woman he'd been married to. That woman had stood a half step behind him at functions like this, quiet, deferential, waiting to be needed. This woman stood at the center of a circle of people who were listening to her, laughing with her leaning toward her, and she was easy and warm and completely herself. And Richard realized he was looking at Evelyn Carter as she'd been before he married her, as she'd been the whole time underneath the version of her he'd spent 20 years pressing flat. He watched her for a long time, and then when the circle around her thinned for a moment, he crossed the room. "Evelyn," he said. She turned, and when she saw him, there was no fear in her face, and no triumph either, and no hatred. There was just a kind of mild, distant recognition, the way you might look at a house you used to live in, driving past it years later. "Richard," she said. "You look well," he said, and it came out more honestly than he intended. "I am well," she said simply. He didn't know how to begin. All the speeches he'd rehearsed in his study at midnight, surrounded by her notebooks, had evaporated. So he said the truest thing he could reach. "I found your notebooks," he said. "In storage. All of them. I've been reading them." Something flickered across her face, then the first real emotion he'd seen, though he couldn't read it. "I wondered where those ended up," she said quietly. "I left them behind on purpose, you know. I didn't want them anymore. That whole part of my life, keeping track of things so you'd be safe, I set it down. It felt good to set it down." "Evelyn." His voice cracked, and he hated that it cracked, and he couldn't stop it. "I didn't know. All those years. The Meridian Trust, the introductions, the warnings, all of it. I genuinely didn't know. I thought I'd done it myself." "I know you didn't know," she said. "I made sure you didn't know. That was the whole point, Richard. A man like you can accept anything except knowing he was helped. So I made it invisible. I made your luck for you and let you keep your pride." She tilted her head, studying him. "The thing I've had to make peace with is that I did that to myself too. I made myself invisible so you could feel big. I chose it. Nobody forced me. And it took me 20 years to understand that a love that requires you to disappear isn't love. It's just a very slow way of vanishing." Richard flinched. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know it's too late. I know the word is too small. But I'm sorry for all of it. For the notebooks I never read. For Cranford. For Miami. For the courtroom. For the joke I made about Lauren's appointment while you were signing away 20 years. His voice was shaking now, openly. "That's the one I can't forgive myself for. I made a joke. You were losing your whole life, and I made a joke about a doctor's appointment." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that he would carry for the rest of his life. "Richard, I want you to hear this because I think you need it, and because after tonight, I don't intend to think about you again." She held his eyes. "I forgive you. I do. Not because you've earned it, but because carrying it costs me more than it costs you, and I'm done carrying things that cost me. So I forgive you." She paused. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it isn't the same as coming back. You didn't lose me because I stopped loving you. You lost me because you never once looked up to see that I was there, and you can't undo that with an apology, no matter how sincere. Some things, once you break them by never noticing them, stay broken, not out of spite, just out of physics." "I understand," Richard said, though he didn't fully, not yet. "I don't think you do," Evelyn said gently, "but you will. Reading those notebooks, you'll understand it eventually. You'll understand that the tragedy was never that you lost the money. The money was always going to leave with me because it was never really yours. The tragedy is that you had a partner, a real one, the kind most people search their whole lives for, and you spent 20 years experiencing her as furniture." She gave him a small, sad smile. "That's the thing you actually lost, Richard. And no board meeting or foundation or apology is going to give it back." And then she did the thing that ended it, the thing that was somehow gentler and more final than any cruelty could have been. She reached out and touched his arm lightly, the way you touch an old acquaintance, and she said, "Take care of yourself, Richard, and take care of that child that's coming. Be better for them than you knew how to be for me. That's the only thing I'd ask of you if I were still in a position to ask anything. Be for them what you couldn't be for me." Then she turned and walked back into her circle of people and did not look back. Richard stood alone in the middle of that room for a long moment, And then he left the party, and he did not tell his lawyer, and he did not care about being visible, and he drove home through the dark city thinking about the last thing she'd said. Be for them what you couldn't be for me. That was the night Richard Hayes started to change, not the empire. That was gone, and he was beginning to accept it. But the man started to change that night slowly, painfully, the way anything grows that has been dead for a long time, because things had changed at home too. Lauren had the baby 3 weeks later, a girl, and something happened to Richard in the delivery room that he had not expected. He looked at his daughter, this tiny, furious red creature who needed him for everything and would remember nothing of who he'd been before her, and he felt for the first time in years something that was not about winning. He felt terror and tenderness and a fierce, disorienting love, and he thought standing there of Evelyn's voice at the party, "Be for them what you couldn't be for me." But Lauren had already made her decision. She'd made it that night in the penthouse when he'd said, "I'll be fine," instead of "we'll be fine," and the baby did not change it. If anything, the baby confirmed it, because now she had someone to protect, and she had watched for months how Richard treated the people who stopped being useful to him, and she was not going to let her daughter be raised inside that arithmetic. She told him a month after the birth. She was calm about it, calmer than he expected, and he understood listening to her that she'd learned that calm from watching Evelyn. "I'm leaving, Richard," Lauren said. "I've got a lawyer. I'm not going to fight you for anything except what she needs, and I'm going to be fair, because I don't want to become someone who spends the next 20 years angry. But I can't stay." She took a breath. "I watched what you did to Evelyn. I told myself it was different with me, that she was the old life, and I was the new one, that I was the one you really loved. But I've realized the truth. There's no version of you that stays. There's just the version of you that hasn't left yet. And I don't want our daughter growing up waiting for the day she stops being useful to you." Richard did not fight her. That was the first evidence, though neither of them recognized it, that he had actually begun to change. The old Richard would have fought, would have threatened, would have made it a war. This Richard just nodded slowly and said, "You're right. I don't blame you." And then after a moment, "Will you let me see her? Not for my sake, for hers. I'd like to try to be what Evelyn told me to be. I probably won't be good at it, but I'd like to try." Lauren studied him surprised, and something in her softened just slightly. "We'll see," she said. "Show me you mean it over time and we'll see. That's the most I can offer." "That's more than I deserve," Richard said, and meant it. So Lauren left with the baby, and Richard was alone in the penthouse that had once been full of the sound of a marriage he'd never appreciated, and then briefly full of a fantasy that had curdled, and now was full of nothing but the echo of his own footsteps and the stack of leather notebooks on his study desk. His company survived in a diminished form. The review committee stabilized it. It was no longer an empire. It was a business, a normal business, the kind of thing a competent man could run without being a genius. And Richard, stripped of his delusion that he was a genius, turned out to be a competent man. He kept the notebooks on his desk. He consulted them. He began in his 50s to learn the things his wife had known at 22, the patience, the humility, the willingness to hear a warning without treating it as an insult. He was not a natural at it, but he tried, and the trying was itself the change. And every so often he would drive uptown past the modest building overlooking the park, and he would slow the car, and he would look up at the windows, and he would not stop. He never stopped. He understood finally that there was nothing left there for him, and that this was not a punishment, but simply the truth, and that the kindest thing he could do with the rest of his life was to leave that woman in the peace she had earned and try to become too late for her, but perhaps not too late for his daughter, the kind of man he should have been. Meanwhile, Evelyn's foundation expanded beyond the city. It went national within the year. Chapters opened in a dozen cities, then 24. The scholarship fund put thousands of women through school. The legal clinics helped thousands more navigate divorces and estates, and the brutal machinery that so often ground down women who had spent their lives caring for others and had nothing in their own name to show for it. And the mentorship program produced over time a whole generation of women who had started their businesses late and succeeded anyway, and many of them, when they succeeded, came back and funded the foundation that had believed in them, so that the whole thing became self-sustaining, a quiet engine of second lights, exactly as Evelyn had designed it. She received awards. She declined most of the attention that came with them, but she accepted the awards themselves, not for her own sake, but because she understood that the visibility helped the women she served. She had spent her whole life avoiding the spotlight, and now in her 50s, she stepped into it deliberately strategically, the way she did everything because it was useful, and she had never in her life done a thing that wasn't. And through all of it, she remained at heart exactly who she'd always been, the quiet Carter, the woman who measured wealth not in what it displayed, but in what it endured, in what it built, in what it left behind. Her grandfather's photograph still hung on her wall, the old man beside the emerald green car, and every morning she still spoke to it. And she told him one morning near the end of that year, "I think you'd be proud, Grandpa. I think this is what the money was always for. Not the towers with somebody's name on them. This." She still drove the Aston Martin. She drove it to the foundation, to meetings, to the small dinners with the women she'd helped. And people who saw her drive by this dignified woman in the emerald green classic had no idea that the car was worth more than most of their homes because Evelyn never told them, and the car never announced itself, and that was in a way the whole point of it. Real value, her grandfather had taught her, never has to announce itself. It simply is whether or not anyone is looking. Richard had looked at that car for 20 years and seen an old toy. He had looked at his wife for 20 years and seen furniture. And the tragedy of his life, the one he finally understood alone in his diminished penthouse, with a stack of notebooks and a daughter he was learning to love, was that he had spent his whole life surrounded by things of immense value and had never once known how to see them. But Evelyn saw. She had always seen. She saw the value in the old car, and in the quiet money, and in the discarded women that the rest of the world had written off, and she spent the second half of her life doing the thing she'd been born to do, the thing she'd postponed for 20 years, the thing that was in the end worth more than any empire. She saw people, and she made them believe they were worth seeing. And somewhere across the city, a man who had finally learned to see was starting over, humbled and alone, holding a stack of notebooks that had taught him too late. Everything he should have known, and driving every so often past a building he would never enter. Learning at last to love without needing to be loved back, which was the only lesson Evelyn had ever really tried to teach him, and the only one he'd ever refused to learn. But before Evelyn's story could reach its fullest expansion, there was one more collision left between the two lives she and Richard had once shared, and it came from a direction neither of them expected. It came from Margaret Hayes. Richard's mother had watched her son's empire crumble from a distance, with the cold detachment she brought to everything, and for months she had said nothing. But Margaret was old money in her own mind, if not in her bank account, and she could not abide the humiliation of watching the Hayes name become a punchline in the very circles she had spent her life trying to impress. So one afternoon, without telling Richard, Margaret did something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. She went to see Evelyn. She arrived at the foundation unannounced, a 76-year-old woman in a tailored coat, and she asked the young receptionist with the imperious certainty of someone accustomed to being received to tell Ms. Carter that Margaret Hayes was here. Evelyn, when the message reached her, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send her in." Margaret entered Evelyn's small, unpretentious office and looked around it with a faint, involuntary surprise, as though she'd expected something grander from a woman worth what Evelyn was now known to be worth. She sat down across from her former daughter-in-law, and for a moment the two women simply regarded each other. Two people who had spent 20 years in the same family and had never once been kind to each other. "You've done well for yourself," Margaret said finally. It was not quite a compliment. It was an accusation dressed as one. "I have," Evelyn agreed, offering nothing more. Margaret's jaw tightened. She had come with a purpose, and she got to it. "My son is ruined. You know that. His business is a shadow. His name is a joke. The woman he left you for has taken his child and gone. He's alone." She paused. "I know you're behind it. Everyone knows. The moment you left, it all came apart. So I've come to ask you, Evelyn, one woman to another, whatever you're doing to him, whatever levers you're still pulling, stop. He's suffered enough. He's my son." And here Evelyn did something that surprised even herself. She laughed, not cruelly, but with a kind of astonished disbelief. "Margaret," she said, You've spent 20 years believing I was too small to matter. You watched your son treat me like furniture and you approved of it. You thought I was a quiet, harmless little wife who'd be lucky to keep him. And now that everything's fallen apart, you've decided I'm some kind of puppet master, secretly pulling levers to destroy him." She shook her head. "You can't have it both ways. Either I was nothing, in which case I can't be behind his ruin, or I was something, in which case you owe me 20 years of the respect you never gave me. Which is it?" Margaret opened her mouth and found she had no answer. "I'm not doing anything to Richard," Evelyn continued, and now her voice was gentle, almost pitying. "I've never done anything to Richard. That's the part none of you can understand. For 20 years I did everything for him, and when I stopped, the only thing that happened was that he was left to stand on his own. That's not revenge, Margaret. That's just the absence of a support he never knew he had. I didn't push him down. I simply stopped holding him up. There's a difference, and the fact that his whole family can't see it tells me everything about why he became who he became." Margaret sat very still, and then slowly the imperious mask cracked, and underneath it, Evelyn saw something she had never expected to see in this woman: fear and grief, and the specific terrible loneliness of a mother watching her child become someone she couldn't defend anymore. "I raised him to be strong," Margaret said quietly, and her voice had lost its edge. "I raised him to need no one. His father was weak, and it destroyed us, and I swore my son would never be weak like that. So I taught him to depend on nothing and no one. I taught him that needing people was a flaw." She looked down at her hands. "I think I taught him too well. I think I taught him not to need people, and he learned instead not to see them. And now he's alone, and I did that. I made him a man who couldn't hold on to the one person who was holding him up." It was, Evelyn realized, the closest thing to honesty that Margaret Hayes had ever spoken in her presence. And Evelyn, who had every right to be cold, found that she could not be, because she understood suddenly that Richard's cruelty had not been born in Richard. It had been handed down the way these things always are from a frightened mother who'd confused hardness with strength and had passed the confusion to her son like an inheritance. "Margaret," Evelyn said, "I'm going to tell you something, and then I'd like you to go because I have work to do and I don't have room in my life for the Hayes family anymore. But I'll tell you this first because I think you need it." She leaned forward. "Your son isn't beyond saving, but he isn't going to be saved by you protecting him, or by me sparing him, or by anyone holding him up again. He's going to be saved, if he's saved at all, by learning to hold himself up and by learning finally to see the people around him before they leave. He has a daughter now. That's his second chance. Not the business. The child. If he learns to see her, to really see her the way he never saw me, then he'll be all right. And if he doesn't, then no amount of you coming to my office and asking me to stop pulling levers I was never pulling is going to save him." She stood. "Go home, Margaret. Let your son grow up. He's 52 years old and he's never once had to, because there was always someone there to catch him. The kindest thing anyone can do for Richard now is to let him fall far enough to learn how to stand." Margaret rose slowly. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment, and something passed across her face that might, in another woman, have been respect. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. "No," Evelyn agreed. "I never was. That was always your mistake and Richard's. You looked at the quietest person in the room and assumed she was the least important one." She almost smiled. "In my experience, it's usually the other way around." Margaret left, and she never came back, and she never told Richard about the visit, but something shifted in her after that day, some slow softening, and in the months that followed, she began awkwardly and late to be a different kind of grandmother to Lauren's daughter than she had been a mother to Richard. It was not much, but it was something. And it had come, like so many things in this story, from a single quiet conversation with a woman everyone had spent their lives underestimating. Word of that meeting never reached the public, but its effect on Evelyn was real. It was the last loose thread of her old life, and cutting it freed something in her. In the weeks after Margaret's visit, Evelyn threw herself into the Foundation's expansion with a new completeness, as though she had finally truly set down the last of the weight she'd been carrying since the day she married Richard Hayes. And the Foundation flourished under that undivided attention. Evelyn opened chapters in the South and the Midwest, in cities where women had even fewer resources and even less hope than the ones she'd started with in New York. She built partnerships with community colleges and trade schools, understanding that not every woman wanted to sit in a lecture hall, that some wanted to learn a trade, to work with their hands, to build something concrete. She created an emergency fund for women fleeing dangerous marriages, women who needed to disappear quickly and safely and had nowhere to turn, and that fund, more than any other part of the foundation, became the thing Evelyn was most quietly proud of because it saved lives literally, and it saved them without ever making a headline. She never took a salary, not $1. The foundation ran on her family's money and on the growing river of donations that her work attracted. And Evelyn lived as she had since the divorce, in the modest apartment overlooking the park, driving the same old car, wearing the same simple clothes, needing almost nothing for herself. Priya, who had been with her from the start, asked her once why she lived so simply when she could have lived like a queen. "Because I spent 20 years surrounded by things that were supposed to prove I was important," Evelyn said. "The penthouse, the galas, the jewelry Richard bought me to display at parties. And none of it ever made me feel like I mattered because it was all about how I looked to other people. I'm done living for how I look to other people, Priya. I have exactly what I need, and everything past what you need is just a heavier version of the same emptiness. I learned that the hard way. I'm not going back." And the women of the foundation loved her for it, loved her in a way that Richard, for all his wealth and all his power, had never once been loved by anyone. Because Evelyn's people did not follow her out of fear, or out of what she could do for them, or out of the reflected glow of her status. They followed her because she had seen them when no one else would, and had made them believe sometimes for the first time in their lives that they were worth seeing. And that kind of loyalty cannot be bought and cannot be inherited and cannot be built on a foundation of using people until they're used up. It can only be earned one person at a time by a lifetime of the very thing Richard had never learned to do. Nearly a year to the day after she'd walked out of that courthouse, dry-eyed, Evelyn stood in front of a room of nearly 300 women at the first national conference of the Second Light Foundation, and she looked out at all those faces, women of every age and every background, women who had been discarded and had refused to stay discarded, and she understood that this was the life she had been meant to live, all along the one she had postponed for 2 decades in the service of a man who never saw her. She did not resent the postponement. That was the thing that struck her standing there. She had thought in the early days after the divorce that she would spend years being angry about the wasted time. But she wasn't angry, because the 20 years hadn't been wasted, not really. They had taught her exactly what these women needed to hear. She could stand in front of a room full of women who had given everything to people who threw them away, and she could say, "I know because I lived it," and they believed her because she had. Her 20 years of silence had become the very thing that let her speak, and that she thought was the final joke of it, the one Richard would never understand. He thought he had taken 20 years from her, but he had without meaning to given her the one qualification that made all of this possible, the credential of having survived him. She would never thank him for it, but she could at last stop resenting it, and that was a freedom in itself. That night, after the conference alone in her apartment, Evelyn stood in front of her grandfather's photograph one more time. "It's working, Grandpa," she said softly. "Everything you taught me, the quiet money, the patience, the not needing anyone to see, it's all working. I just needed to lose everything the world told me was mine to find the thing that actually was." She touched the frame. "Thank you for the car, and thank you for teaching me what it meant. Richard never once asked, but I always knew." And somewhere across the city, Richard Hayes sat in his study with his daughter asleep on his chest on one of the evenings Lauren now allowed him learning the slow, humbling, unfamiliar work of loving something more than he loved himself. He had a notebook open beside him, one of Evelyn's, and in it he had begun clumsily to write his own notes. Not about business, about his daughter. What made her laugh? What frightened her? The small daily observations of a man learning at 52 to pay attention. He would never be Evelyn. He knew that now, but he was at last trying to become someone who could see. And though it had cost him everything to learn the lesson, and though he had learned it far too late to keep the woman who'd tried for 20 years to teach it to him, he was learning it. And that in the end was the only inheritance Evelyn had ever really wanted to leave anyone. Not money, not towers, just the simple world-changing ability to look at another person and truly see them. A full year after that first national conference, the invitation arrived that would bring the whole story to its close, and it arrived fittingly in the quietest possible way, a plain envelope on Evelyn's desk that Priya almost set aside with the rest of the mail. But Priya opened it, and then she stood very still, and then she walked into Evelyn's office, holding it with both hands. "Evelyn," she said, "you need to see this." Evelyn took the letter. She read it once, then again, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. It was from the National Committee that gave out one of the most prestigious honors in the country for leadership and philanthropy, an award that had gone in previous years to former presidents and Nobel laureates and the founders of movements that had changed the shape of American life. And this year, the committee had written after reviewing the extraordinary and quiet impact of the Second Light Foundation, and the woman behind it, they wished to present that award to Evelyn Carter. "They want to give it to you on stage," Priya said, her voice thick, "at the National Gala, in front of everyone. Evelyn, do you understand what this is? This is the top. There's nothing above this." Evelyn set the letter down on her desk with a hand that was not quite steady, and for the first time in the years Priya had known her, the composed, unshakable Evelyn Carter looked as though she might cry. "My grandfather was nominated for this once," Evelyn said softly, 40 years ago, for everything the family financed, all the infrastructure, all the quiet building, and he turned it down. He said the Carters don't accept awards because the moment you stand on a stage and let them thank you, you've admitted you did it to be thanked." She touched the letter. "He turned it down, Priya, and I've spent my whole life following his rules, the quiet money, the invisible good, never being seen." "So you'll turn it down too?" Priya said, and there was disappointment in her voice she couldn't hide. And here Evelyn did something that surprised them both. She shook her head. "No," she said slowly. "No, I don't think I will." She looked up. "My grandfather turned it down because for him being unseen was a strength. He had all the power in the world and he chose to hide it, and that was noble in its way. But Priya, I've spent my whole life being unseen. For 20 years I made myself invisible so that a man could feel important. Being unseen was never my choice. It was my cage." She stood, and something in her had changed, some final piece settling into place. "So I'm not going to turn it down. I'm going to accept it. And I'm going to stand on that stage in front of everyone and let myself be seen. Not for me. For every woman in this foundation who spent her whole life being invisible and was told that was all she was good for. I'm going to stand up there and let them look at me. And every one of those women is going to see that a woman who was thrown away can end up exactly here." Her voice caught. "That's worth breaking one of my grandfather's rules for. I think he'd understand. I think actually he'd be proud." Priya wiped her eyes. "You have to drive the Aston Martin," she said, half laughing. "You have to. If you're going to finally let yourself be seen, you show up in that car." Evelyn laughed too, and it was a real laugh, full and free. "Oh, I'm driving the Aston Martin," she said. "There was never any question about that." News of the awards spread the way things spread when they involve a name the public has come to love, and it reached inevitably Richard. He heard about it from Lauren of all people. They had settled by then into a careful, functional co-parenting, the two of them bound by the little girl they shared, and Lauren had grown to a place where she could speak to Richard about Evelyn without it being a wound. "Did you see," Lauren said when she dropped their daughter off one evening, "that Evelyn's getting the National Leadership Award, the big one. They're presenting it at the gala next month. It's a huge deal, Richard. Presidents have gotten that award." Richard was quiet. He had known Evelyn's foundation had grown. He had followed it from a distance the way he now followed everything about her life, not obsessively, not with longing exactly, but with the steady, humbled attention of a man who had learned too late to pay attention to the things that mattered. But this was different. This was the summit. "That's wonderful," he said, and he found to his own surprise that he meant it. Completely. Without a single thread of the old jealousy, the old need to be the biggest man in every room. "She deserves it. She deserves more than that." Lauren studied him for a moment, and there was something in her expression that was almost tender. "You've changed, you know," she said. "The old Richard couldn't have said that and meant it. The old Richard would have found a way to make it about himself." "The old Richard lost everything worth having," Richard said quietly. "It turns out that's a very effective teacher." And then he asked Lauren something he had not planned to ask. "Do you think I could go to the gala, not to talk to her?" "God, no. I've said everything I have any right to say to Evelyn, and I said it a year ago, and she gave me more grace than I deserved. I'd never intrude on her night." He paused. "But I'd like to be there, in the back, just to see it, just to watch her get the thing she should have been getting her whole life, the thing I spent 20 years standing in front of." His voice grew rough. "I spent 2 decades blocking that woman's light, Lauren. I'd like to sit in a dark room and watch her finally get to shine, and know that at least this time, I'm not the reason she can't." Lauren was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I think that might be the most honest thing you've ever said to me." She nodded slowly. "Go. Sit in the back. Watch her win. I think you need to Richard. I think it might be the last thing you need to close the door." So Richard went. The gala was held in a grand hall filled with the most accomplished people in the country, and Evelyn arrived exactly as she had promised, at the wheel of the emerald green 1963 Aston Martin DB5, the car her grandfather had bought with the first real money the Carter family ever made, the car Richard had spent 20 years calling an old collector's toy. But something was different this time. A year earlier, on the courthouse steps, the cameras had swarmed. The car dazzled by the machine, the rare and priceless object. Now, as Evelyn pulled up to the gala, the cameras did not go to the car at all. They went to the woman, to her face, her calm, her presence. The car had become, over the course of that year, almost beside the point. It was no longer the story. She was the story. The Aston Martin was just the thing that carried her, and everyone knew, watching her step out of it, that the truly rare and priceless object had never been the automobile. It had always been the woman behind the wheel. Evelyn moved through the gala the way she moved through everything, now warmly, unhurriedly, entirely herself. And Richard sat in the back in the shadows, in a plain seat far from the stage, watching the woman he'd been married to for 20 years be celebrated by a room full of people who understood, as he finally understood exactly what she was worth. He was not bitter. He was not envious. He sat in that dark room, and he felt of all things grateful. Grateful that he had lived long enough and lost enough to be able to see it, this thing he'd been blind to for 2 decades, unfolding right in front of him. When they called her name, the entire hall rose to its feet. 300, 400, 500 of the most powerful people in the country standing applauding for a woman who a year and a half earlier had walked out of a divorce that everyone assumed had destroyed her. And Evelyn walked up onto that stage into the full light, the light she had hidden from her entire life, and she stood at the podium and looked out at all of them. And Richard, watching from the back, saw her take a breath, and he knew her well enough, even now, to know that she was steadying herself, that this moment cost her something, that stepping into the light was still, even now, an act of courage for a woman who had spent so long in the dark. And then Evelyn Carter spoke. "Thank you," she began. "I almost didn't accept this award. My grandfather was offered something like it once and he turned it down. He believed the best work was invisible work, that the moment you let yourself be thanked, you admitted you did it to be thanked. And I loved him, and I followed his rules for most of my life. I spent decades being invisible." She paused, and the room was utterly silent. "But I've come to believe he was only half right, because I've spent the last 2 years surrounded by women who were made invisible against their will. Women who gave everything to families and marriages and children, and then were told when it was over that they were worth nothing. Women who were rendered invisible not as a noble choice, but as a punishment for a lifetime of love." Her voice grew stronger, and I realized that for those women, being seen isn't vanity. It's survival. It's the thing they were denied. And if I stood up here and refused this award in the name of humble invisibility, I would be telling every one of them that the light they've been begging for their whole lives isn't worth wanting, and I will not tell them that. So I'm accepting this award in the light on my feet for all of them. The applause began, but she raised a hand gently, and it stilled because they wanted to hear the rest. People have asked me over these last 2 years how I did it, how I walked away from a long marriage with nothing and built this instead. And they always expect a story about revenge. They want me to say I did it to prove something to someone, to get even, to win. She shook her head slowly. But I didn't. I want to tell you the truth tonight because I think it matters, and I think there are people in this room and watching who need to hear it. She looked out over the crowd, and though she could not have known Richard was there in the back, in the dark, her words landed on him as though she'd aimed them. I spent 20 years, Evelyn said, believing that my worth was something another person got to measure. I let someone else hold the ruler, and every year the number he assigned me got smaller, and I kept believing it because when you love someone you trust them to tell you the truth about yourself. Her voice trembled just slightly, and then held. And then one day, I walked out of a room where a man had just decided out loud in front of everyone that I was worth nothing at all. And I got into a car my grandfather had left me, and I drove away. And somewhere on that drive I understood the thing that changed my whole life. She paused. I understood that he had never had the ruler. Nobody had. My worth was never his to measure, and it was never mine to earn from him. And it had never once in 20 years gone up or down based on what he thought of it. It had simply been there the whole time, exactly as large as it always was, waiting for me to stop asking someone else for permission to feel it. The room had gone completely still. The greatest freedom in my life, Evelyn said, was not becoming successful after my divorce. It was not this foundation or this award or any of the things you're all so kindly celebrating tonight. The greatest freedom was the moment I discovered that my worth had never been tied to another person's approval, that it never is, that it never was for any of us, not for me, not for the women in my foundation, not for anyone in this room. She looked out at them, and she smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side, not burned, but forged. You are not worth what the person who hurt you decided you were worth. You never were. And the day you stop believing their number and start living from your own is the day your real life begins. I know, because mine began at 50 in a courthouse in a car everyone told me I should have sold. And then she said the last thing, the thing that would be replayed and shared and repeated for years, the thing that would become the truest summary of everything she'd learned. The most valuable thing any of us will ever own, Evelyn Carter said, is not money or a title or the approval of the people who were supposed to love us and didn't. The most valuable thing any of us will ever own is the courage to walk away with our self-respect intact. That's the whole inheritance. That's the only fortune that can't be taken from you because it was never given to you by anyone else in the first place. Thank you. The hall erupted. The entire room was on its feet, and many of them were weeping, and the applause went on, and Evelyn stood in the light and let herself be seen fully at last, a woman who had spent 50 years in the shadows and had earned through the hardest possible road the right to stand in the sun. And in the back of the room in the dark, Richard Hayes was on his feet too, applauding with tears running down his face. And he was not applauding because he wanted anything or hoped for anything or imagined for 1 second that any door was open to him. He was applauding because the woman he had failed to see for 20 years was finally being seen by the whole world, and he had lived long enough and lost enough to understand what a miracle that was, and to be at last simply glad of it. He thought about approaching her. For one moment, in the swell of the applause, he thought about pushing through the crowd, reaching the stage, telling her he was there, telling her he'd seen it, telling her he understood now completely everything she'd said and everything she'd meant. But he didn't, because he understood standing there that it would be for him, not for her, that she did not need his witness or his apology or his understanding. She had built a life so complete that Richard Hayes was not even a footnote in it anymore, and the kindest, most loving thing he could do, the one genuinely selfless act available to a man who had spent his life taking, was to let her have this night without the shadow of him falling across it even once. So Richard slipped out the back of the hall while the applause still thundered, and he stepped out into the night, and he did not look back. He got into his car, his ordinary car, and he drove home to the modest apartment he lived in now, and he checked on his daughter asleep in the next room, and he sat down at his desk, where Evelyn's notebook still rested, and he opened his own notebook, the one he'd started keeping, and he wrote a single line. "Saw Evelyn get the award tonight. She was magnificent. I'm glad I got to see it." He closed the notebook. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Hayes slept without the weight of who he used to be pressing down on his chest, because he had finally fully let her go. And in letting her go, he had become at the very last a little more like the man she'd once believed he could be. Some doors close forever. Richard had learned that, and he had made his peace with it, and the making of that peace was the only redemption available to him, and it was in its quiet way enough. Evelyn on the stage did not see him leave. She did not know he had been there at all, and that was exactly as it should be, because her night was never about him, and her life was no longer about him, and the last thread connecting her story to his had been cut long ago, cleanly without cruelty, the way she did everything. She stayed at the gala long after the ceremony ended, talking with the women she'd come with, the women of the foundation, Carol and Priya, and a dozen others, whose lives had been remade by a woman who understood that the greatest thing you can give a person is the belief that they are worth seeing. And when it was finally time to go, she walked out to the emerald green Aston Martin alone in the cool night, and she stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting on the roof of the car her grandfather had bought a lifetime ago. "Well, Grandpa," she said softly to the night, "I stood in the light. I know you always said not to, but I think you'd have understood if you'd seen those women's faces. I think you'd have said the rule was made for a different kind of person in a different kind of life." She patted the car gently. "Thank you for this. Not the car. What it taught me, that the most valuable things never announce themselves. They just endure quietly waiting for someone with the eyes to see them." She smiled. "It took me 50 years to become someone with those eyes, but I got there, and I have you to thank for it." Then she got behind the wheel, and she started the engine, and it came to life with that same deep, unhurried sound it had made on the courthouse steps a year and a half earlier, the sound of something built in an age when things were made to last, and to be beautiful and to endure. And Evelyn Carter drove out into the New York evening alone, unhurried, magnificent, the emerald green car carrying her home through streets full of light. The car was worth millions. Everyone knew that now. But the woman behind the wheel had learned the one thing the car had been trying to teach her for her whole life, the thing Richard had looked at for 20 years and never once seen, the thing that no fortune and no empire and no man's approval could ever provide or ever take away. Her worth had never been tied to anyone's opinion of it. It never had been, and it never would be again. She had walked away from a billionaire's world with dry eyes and a car everyone told her to sell, and she had built out of the wreckage of the life she was supposed to mourn something worth more than everything she'd left behind. Not because she'd wanted revenge, but because she had finally understood that the only fortune that matters is the one no one can give you and no one can take from you. The courage to walk away with your self-respect intact. Evelyn Carter had owned that fortune all along. It just took losing everything else for her to finally fully claim it. And as the emerald green Aston Martin disappeared into the glittering distance of the city she had conquered without ever once fighting for it, one truth stood clear above all the rest, the truth this whole story had been building toward from the moment she signed those papers without a single tear. The most powerful person in any room is almost never the one demanding to be seen. It is the quiet one in the corner, the one everyone underestimates, the one who knows exactly what she is worth and has stopped needing anyone else to agree. Evelyn Carter was that woman. She had always been that woman. And in the end, the whole world learned what Richard Hayes discovered too late, that the person you overlook, the person you dismiss, the person you are certain will break, may turn out to be the strongest soul you will ever have the privilege to know. She did not break. She was never going to break. And that in the end was the truest thing about her.